Chapter 1927. Although Luo Fan had only condensed a wisp of law power, Luo Fan's manipulation method, which had deepened to the conceptual level, was enough for him to play with this wisp of law power to the acme of perfection. It was enough for him to do countless things that ordinary people thought could only be done by gods. For example, as he raised his hand and drew the outline, the speed suddenly increased by tens of thousands of times. In the blink of an eye, an extremely complicated rune was outlined in front of him, and all the information about the worldview of the particles in his mind was integrated into the rune at the same time. In other words, in the blink of an eye, a complicated rune that carried the worldview of the particles had appeared in front of Luo Fan. Although this rune did not have any carrier, under the effect of Luo Fan's law power, it seemed to have a real substance. It wriggled slightly in the air, as if it had come to life, showing no signs of dissipating at all. At this moment, the wisp of extraordinary power that was born because of the worldview of the particles seemed to have found its source. The scattered power cards quickly gathered toward this rune. In the blink of an eye, they had completely gathered on it. The wisp of power began to swim toward the rune like a swimming dragon. In a short while, it had already arrived in front of the rune and crashed into it. As the extraordinary power poured into it, the rune began to tremble violently. Gradually, it emitted an indescribable light. This light seemed to be formed by the accumulation of some indescribable particles. It spread in all directions, as if another sun had been added to this boundless starry sky. After the countless particles that formed the light were thousands of feet away from the rune, they naturally dissipated and returned to the rune in an indescribable way, vaguely. A special cycle was formed. The power is a little less. Otherwise, it should be able to produce some kind of qualitative transformation. Luo Fan looked at the changes in the rune. He was happy and regretful. He was happy. Naturally, his guess was correct. The combination of that power and worldview could produce a tremendous might, allowing him to erupt with a great power that he did not have before. It was a pity that the strand of extraordinary power was too little, so it was not enough to truly activate the rune and fully unleash the great power. As a result, Luo Fan could not confirm the strength and essence of the power. With such a sigh, he activated the power of law. In an instant, an indescribable suction force came from his hand and directly acted on the rune. The rune began to move towards him due to the suction force. That kind of arduous and slow manner was like he was pulling a towering mountain. As the rune approached Luo Fan's palm, the intense light emitted from the rune gradually faded. By the time it landed on Luo Fan's palm, the light had completely faded and turned into a faint layer of smoke that surrounded the rune, making it look somewhat illusory. It was as if he had walked out of a dream. As for the main body of the rune, it had now completely turned into an irregular card due to this process. Whether it was the front or the back of the card, it looked like the rune. In the depths of the rune, there were all kinds of complex changes that could not be described with words. There seemed to be countless worlds, countless spacetime, and countless living beings living, struggling, fighting, and reminiscing. Luo Fan, who was extremely familiar with spacetime, could naturally see at a glance that those were not real spacetime. They were not real worlds, and they were not real living beings. Everything was everything. They were just the embodiment of the worldview of the particles. Strictly speaking, they were just the operating rules and changing rules of the extraordinary power that was born from the worldview of the particles. He grabbed the card. An indescribable heaviness pressed down on Luo Fan's hand. No matter how much strength he used, the weight of the card seemed to exceed his, causing his palm to sink uncontrollably. This was the weight of the world. With a slight thought, the wisp of law power in his body began to pour into his palm, and it began to circulate inside his palm. As the law power took effect, the weight of the card completely disappeared, and was replaced by a light feeling, as if the card was not material at all and had no weight at all. However, in contrast to this, His law power was making faint crackling sounds, as if it was enduring an indescribably terrifying pressure. In this situation, it was obvious that Luo Fan was using the extraordinary power that was also born from the worldview to offset the weight of the world contained in the card. Only the world could support the world. With a slight thought, Luo Fan sat down in the starry sky with his legs crossed. It was as if his body was floating in the center of the universe, and the stars around him changed, just like the flow of time. In between his hands, the card began to slowly float up, and gradually, the light formed by the particles began to slowly spread out. However, this time, the light did not scatter in all directions aimlessly. Instead, it began to stretch and shrink around the card, as if it was breathing. During this process, it seemed to be absorbing something from the card, and also from the surrounding spacetime, appearing extremely mysterious. At this moment, Luo Fan activated his law power and condensed it in his eyes, carefully observing the changes in the light and the rune. The rune that could carry the worldview was not a fixed rune. After it appeared, it would naturally undergo all kinds of corresponding changes according to the information attached to it. In other words, as long as one knew the rules of the rune's changes, just by observing the changes of the rune, it would be enough to clearly analyze all the changes in the worldview carried on it. For example, at this moment, in his eyes, the worldview of the particles was undergoing indescribable micro-adjustments along with the operation of the wisp of extraordinary power. This adjustment was going on all the time. The adjustments that were carried out at all times were extremely insignificant, but as long as enough time passed, the worldview would inevitably undergo earth-shaking changes. Time passed minute by minute and second by second. Half a month later, Luo Fan's expression finally changed. After half a month of accumulation, the worldview of the particles had already changed. It had long changed. The current worldview was already specious, and there seemed to be multiple worldviews that had been forcibly stuffed into it, appearing extremely distorted and unpredictable, and the cause of all this was none other than the wisp of extraordinary power that was born from the worldview of the particles. It seems that the thing that this wisp of extraordinary power lacks is extremely important. Luo Fan, who had been silent for half a month, let out a long sigh at this moment. Following this sigh, he suddenly clenched his fist, and the power of laws quickly condensed in his fist. During this process, this magic power stirred the rules of the outside world, causing his fist to receive more and more power. In the end, it allowed his fist to unleash a power that was more than 1,000,000 times greater than the magic power of the rules. Under his control, he brazenly smashed it towards the rune. Bang! In the face of the power that was 1,000,000 times greater than the law of dermic power, the rune couldn't put up any resistance at all and was blasted apart. The extraordinary power contained in the rune was also washed away by the power. It dissipated into the void. During this process, there wasn't much of a commotion, as if the runes were just piled up with sand. It could be seen from this. How powerful was the rune under the blessing of the extraordinary power? It could even deduce how terrifying the power of Luo Fan's punch was just now. It could be said that if the punch had not landed on the rune but on the ground within a radius of 100 miles would have instantly turned into powder. After the rune was broken up, Luo Fan retracted the power of laws and let it circle around his heart. He began to use his extraordinary perception to carefully sense everything about the power of laws. If he had sensed it like this in the beginning, it would have been difficult for him to sense anything. But now, after comparing the particles of laws, he looked at the power of laws again. However, he already had many new insights. Vaguely, the mysteries of the power of laws gradually filled his heart. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, another year had passed. On this day, Luo Fan, who was in the cultivation room, had a thought. The mysteries of the infinite power of laws instantly condensed into a little light in his heart. In an instant, it gave him a kind of enlightenment that he had been looking for a long time. So it's because I'm lacking a heart. When such a thought emerged in his heart, it instantly removed all the doubts he had encountered before. He finally understood why the extraordinary power derived from the worldview would cause the worldview to become chaotic. The worldview was the summary of a living being's understanding of everything that existed outside of itself. The power derived from such a worldview was naturally just a kind of pure power. No matter how mysterious it was and how incredible its power was, it was still just power. Since it was power, the way it was operated and the way it was used was naturally limited to the level of power. If there was no mind to control it, this wisp of power would naturally change everything according to the power's instincts. The worldview that was born from it would naturally be within the scope of change. Therefore, if this extraordinary power was allowed to continue existing, then the worldview would gradually change in a direction that could make that wisp of power stronger. In the end, it would become extremely chaotic only by completely integrating one's mind, will, and belief into it could one control this extraordinary power forever. Only then could one follow the extraordinary power and the worldview and the will of the existence that condensed this worldview. After understanding this, Luo Fan naturally knew how to use this power to begin his cultivation. For a moment, an indescribable joy emerged in his heart. Under this joy, he could not help but laugh out loud. Although he had not paid attention to external things for more than a year, as one of the most powerful people in this world, Luo Fan's industry naturally had many people helping him to control it. At this time, although there were already some signs of chaos, it still remained intact. As long as he went out, it would be able to settle down again. As for the meeting that the Federation president had arranged, it was not worth a dime to him at all. Naturally, he could not be bothered to pay attention to it. After laughing out loud, his whole body relaxed. His heart moved. He suddenly had the thought of caring about his own industry. Immediately, he summoned the artificial intelligence and asked about the development of his industry these days. The artificial intelligence's voice was still melodious, no different from before. "Congratulations on your success in cultivation, Mr. Because Mr. has been cultivating in seclusion these days, the number of documents that need to be reviewed by Mr. has been accumulating. Now there are 3,298 documents. Mr., would you like to review them immediately? You can directly review them according to my style. Apart from this, how is the situation at the Research Institute?" Luo Fan said indifferently. If it was an ordinary person, giving up this kind of review authority, even if it was to the artificial intelligence, would be suicidal. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not an ordinary person. For him, these industries were enough to allow him to obtain the greatest power and the highest status in this world, but it was only for the sake of exploring the truth of cultivation. As long as he achieved his goal, it did not matter whether they still existed or not. Under such circumstances, if maintaining these industries would delay his cultivation, he would not hesitate to let go of them. Just like now, reviewing more than 3,000 documents was a troublesome matter that delayed his cultivation, so he naturally threw it to the artificial intelligence. "Yes, Mr. The artificial intelligence said calmly. After saying this, it then answered another question that Luo Fan asked. During the time that Mr. was in seclusion, the Research Institute produced a total of 17,610 results. Among them, there were 34 results that Mr. paid attention to. They are: Next, the artificial intelligence used this kind of melodious tone to continuously tell Luo Fan about the various results in the Research Institute, as well as the cost of these results and the estimated profits when it was done. Luo Fan was a little satisfied, but also a little disappointed. He was satisfied because there were many results. There were many that were useful to him. What disappointed him, however, was that not only did the research on extraordinary powers that he had been most concerned with not bear fruit, but he had also lost all his previous research. He had failed 13 times in a row, and even now, He was still grooming a test subject that had a chance of deriving extraordinary powers. After asking all these questions, Luo Fan was no longer interested. He immediately dismissed the artificial intelligence and prepared to continue his cultivation. At this moment, the artificial intelligence suddenly appeared again and said, "Mr. The Federation President once again requests to meet with you. This is already the 30th time this month, and the 327th time this year." Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. He still hasn't given up? Is there really something that I can't do? Otherwise, with so many other families and companies that are slightly weaker than him in terms of power, why didn't he ask for their help at all and instead kept pestering me? Tell him to wait for me in the reception room. Out of curiosity, Lin Huang ordered. Then, he stretched his body and slowly walked out of the cultivation room. Although the focus of his understanding of the world of laws these days was to find the key to its lack, with Luo Fan's wisdom, after facing this power for such a long time, even if he didn't put in any effort, he had already instinctively developed countless uses of this power. In other words, the current him seemed to have countless abilities. With a thought, he had already embedded the power of laws into the rules, causing subtle vibrations between the rules. Naturally, he had already sensed this building in his heart. It was also in an instant that he found the location of the Federation President. Immediately afterward, with a thought, he used the power of laws to pry open the rules. In his eyes, space turned into something that could be folded at will like a piece of paper. With just a thought, he had already folded the space between this place and the guest room. With a single step, he had already traversed the space and appeared in the guest room, sitting on the seat that was specially prepared for him. The Federation President was a fat man in his 50s. His clothes seemed simple, but they were actually luxurious, which made his superior aura extremely high. However, even though his aura was extraordinary, he couldn't hide the anxiety and even fear on his face. The way Luo Fan crossed space and appeared in front of him was very strange, but it only made his expression change slightly. After all, although the overall technology in this world was not too advanced, there was a lot of black technology. As one of the most powerful existences in this world, it was normal for Luo Fan to want a piece of black technology that could allow him to jump through space. At this moment, he immediately stood up and bowed to Luo Fan. Bending his body 90 degrees, he said sincerely, "I'm really sorry to disturb you, Mr. Luo Fan, but this time, I really have no choice. Even though I know that I will disturb you, I still have to come. Please forgive me, Mr. Luo Fan." Chapter 1928. When the Federation President heard this, he hurriedly said, "The origin of this matter was more than 2 years ago." Hearing this, Luo Fan raised his eyebrows. This time seemed to be the time when he entered this world and set foot in this world. However, he didn't interrupt his narration and just listened quietly. As the Federation President narrated, Luo Fan also gradually understood what exactly happened. More than 2 years ago, it seemed that when Luo Fan appeared in this world, another kind of existence appeared in this world. At the very beginning, it was just a strange sculpture, but as time passed, it gradually gained life, as if it was gradually coming to life. If that was all there was to it, then it would just be a rather strange creature. The reason why the president of the Federation was so anxious and even fearful was because anyone who touched the stone would be corroded by it. They would treat the stone as their strongest belief, and they would even be willing to die for it and offer their everything to it. With such a mentality, it was naturally necessary to help the stone expand its belief and let more people touch it. Therefore, although this stone had only appeared for more than 2 years, there were already hundreds of thousands of people in the entire Federation who fanatically believed in that sculpture. And these people who fanatically believed in this sculpture completely disregarded everything else and wholeheartedly wanted to spread the belief of that sculpture so that all the living creatures in this world would become like them and offer everything they had to this sculpture. Therefore, the Federation government made a prompt decision and directly locked up these hundreds of thousands of people separately. They even used a lot of manpower and material resources to seal the sculpture. However, this was obviously only treating the symptoms and not the root cause. The hundreds of thousands of people who were locked up were almost all the higher-ups of the Federation. They were all existences with extremely high status and identity. If any of them had a problem, it would cause more or less problems to appear in the entire Federation. Moreover, there were problems with hundreds of thousands of people all at once. At this time, the entire Federation seemed very normal, but it was already the result of the Federation government using all means to maintain it. And so on and so forth. The collapse of the order of the entire Federation was right in front of them. Moreover, there were quite a few people among the hundreds of thousands of people who possessed all sorts of special technique. Although the prison was tight, no one dared to say that none of them would be able to escape. If any one of them managed to escape, the consequences would be unimaginable. From these aspects, it could be said that the entire Federation was on the brink of chaos. If there was no way to deal with that rock, then the collapse of the Federation would only be a matter of time. Then why me? There should be a lot of people who can find out about these things. Luo Fan said faintly. It was just chaos in one corner of the world. It was nothing to him. One had to know that every time he fought in the past, he would create billions of worlds and destroy billions of worlds. He was like this. Not to mention the chaos in the Federation, even if this world was completely destroyed in front of his eyes, he wouldn't be able to do anything about it. As long as he was fine, he would not be moved by this. Seeing how calm Luo Fan was, the Federation president became anxious and said, Mr. Luo only needs to look at the appearance of this stone and you will naturally know why we are looking for you. As he spoke, he took out a document from the file box beside him. He placed it on the table and pushed it to Luo Fan. Luo Fan was curious. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The document was pulled by an invisible force into his hand. He flipped it open. It was filled with information about that rock. When it appeared, where it appeared, what happened after that, where it was transferred to, what happened again, what changes happened to the rock itself, and so on and so forth. It was so detailed that it was beyond imagination. However, all of this was meaningless to Luo Fan. To him, the most meaningful thing was the photo of that rock. After looking at this photo, he already knew why the Federation president would look for him. Because that rock's appearance was shockingly exactly the same as him. It wasn't the appearance of an ordinary sculpture, but it was as if it had been printed in the same mold as him. It could be said that if the rock and Luo Fan were placed together, and Luo Fan made the same pose as the rock, then very few people in this world would be able to find out which was Luo Fan and which was the rock. Under such circumstances, even a fool would not believe that this rock and this sculpture had nothing to do with him. If Luo Fan was just an ordinary person, even if he was a famous person with a little bit of power and wealth, the Federation president would definitely capture him for research in the name of the entire Federation. If it was necessary, he would even do something like slicing him up without any hesitation. However, it was clear that the current Luo Fan was someone who had the power to leave the Federation president behind for an entire year if he wanted to. If the Federation president had the idea of capturing him for research, the most likely outcome would not be Luo Fan being captured, but the Federation president himself being captured and sliced up instead. Under such circumstances, what other choice could the Federation government make? Of course, they could only come to Luo Fan to solve this problem. The Federation government appeared to be extremely respectful on the surface, but their hearts were obviously filled with unwillingness, humiliation, and helplessness. However, this did not affect Luo Fan at all. At this moment, his brows were already deeply furrowed. A rock that looked exactly like him was slowly regaining its vitality, as if it was gradually coming back to life. It even had a strong ability to infect living creatures, causing them to involuntarily believe in it. What kind of existence was this? Send that rock over. At that moment, Luo Fan directly said to the Federation president. Hearing this, the Federation president's expression changed and he said, Mr. Luo, I'm afraid, right now, you are the one begging me, not the other way around, Luo Fan said calmly. The Federation president's expression stiffened. After a while, he gritted his teeth and said, In that case, we will immediately send that sculpture over. Please be careful, Mr. Luo. That thing is really too evil. Go down. Send it over as soon as possible, Luo Fan said calmly. As he said that, he closed the document in his hand and stood up. With the help of the law power in his body, he touched the mysterious laws of the outside world. In a flash, he had already passed through time and space and directly arrived at the place where the rock had first appeared, as recorded in the document. Due to the existence of that rock, this place had long become an important military place. The defense was extremely tight. There were soldiers everywhere, and all kinds of defensive equipment were everywhere. If one wanted to invade this place using orthodox methods, even Luo Fan would probably have to spend a lot of effort to do so. However, at this moment, Luo Fan had already easily passed through the layers of obstacles with the help of the law power and appeared in the depths of this important military place. At the place where the rock had first appeared. This place was originally a desert. The temperature difference between day and night was extremely huge. It was currently noon, and it was the time when the sun was at its strongest. There was a large pit where the sand had been burned and solidified into crystals. In the depths of the pit, there were 2 solidified footprints. It was as if the pit was created by the owner of these 2 footprints. Under the intense refraction of the sun, this place was like a furnace. It was extremely hot. It's exactly the same as my footprints. Looking at the 2 footprints, Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, he was even more puzzled about the origin of the rock. With a slight thought, he began to use his law power to pry open the surrounding laws and carefully observe the footprints from top to bottom. As a world that studied worldviews, the technological system of this world was extremely different from the technological worlds that Luo Fan knew of. Their manipulation of laws was far from what other technological worlds could compare to. But it was far from what other technological worlds could compare with. Just like this place, after they cleaned it up, Luo Fan actually spent a few hours not sensing any abnormalities. It was as if there were 2 footprints that had appeared out of thin air. Impossible. If I can really get rid of it, then I can easily get rid of the negative effects of the stone. There is no need to come to me. With such a thought flashing through his mind, Luo Fan frowned and walked to the side of the footprints. After thinking about it, he finally made a decision and slowly stood on the 2 footprints. These 2 footprints were exactly the same as his own. As a result, when he stood on them, his feet and the footprints were naturally seamless, as if he was born to stand on them. At this moment, there was only an indescribable expression on Luo Fan's face. The temperature suddenly began to drop, and in the blink of an eye, it was close to freezing point. As the temperature dropped, the surrounding world started to change rapidly, as if time had suddenly reversed. Day and night continued to change again and again. The surrounding encirclement gradually became broken. One by one, figures walked backward around the big pit, and one by one, armed soldiers looked at him with extreme vigilance. After this continued for hundreds of times, a large number of people knelt in front of him and worshipped him with incomparable fanaticism. Then, they worshipped him one by one and touched him one by one. This is the memory of this footprint. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already understood what he had seen. Although he did not know why the memory of this footprint would appear in this way, Luo Fan did not care about it at this time. He just seized the time to observe everything around him, and carefully sensed any trace of abnormality. Unfortunately, this was after all only the memory of the footprint. Although he could see the entire evolution process through these memories, He could not go deep to understand the various mysteries revealed behind it. When the last scene turned into darkness, Luo Fan did not find anything he wanted to find. This is the beginning of the footprint memory. As he thought of this, the surrounding scene returned to that crystal big pit, and the temperature also returned to the previous kind of scorching heat. After looking at the footprint memory for such a long time, he finally came to one conclusion. That was, the sculpture did not fall from the sky. Instead, it appeared out of thin air. This deep pit did not appear because of a powerful impact, but because the speed at which the sculpture appeared was too fast. It directly impacted the surrounding space, creating a kind of shock wave that swept away the surrounding sand and stones. It melted and solidified into this appearance. Is this a change in fate or an accident? As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan took a light step forward, and he had already pried open the rules and laws, folding space, and directly arrived in his own building, appearing on the 365th floor underground. This was already the deepest part of this building. There were no other researchers in this place. There were only empty laboratories, or rather, activity rooms and cultivation rooms. This was the research place that Luo Fan had specially prepared for himself. It was also the place where the next sculpture would be sent to. As the research center that Luo Fan had specially arranged, the lower the underground space of this building, the more important the things that were researched. The 200 floors underground were the levels where the most important things that could be openly researched were located. Starting from the 201st floors below this one, up to the 364th floor, there were all kinds of research that could not see the light of day. For example, the method of human extinction and so on. Only the 365th floor. It completely belonged to Luo Fan, and he had built it for himself. Every underground floor was not an ordinary floor. Instead, it was an extremely large space. Therefore, the 365th floor was already hundreds of thousands of meters deep underground. Below it, even though Luo Fan was here, he could still clearly sense the intense heat emitted from the magma. He could even smell the sulfuric odor of the earth fire within it. After waiting for a while, the elevator door opened. The artificial intelligence had already sent the sculpture that the Federation president had sent over to this floor. "Sir, the goods have been delivered, please check and accept." Luo Fan looked over and saw that the sculpture had been tightly sealed at this time. It was sealed in all directions with the most airtight alloy material in the world. At first glance, it looked like a huge can. He walked over and knocked on it, and a strange echo came from inside. This echo told him that it was a vacuum inside. Even the contact with the air is isolated? It seems that it is really tight. Luo Fan sighed, and with a slight turn of his magical power, he inserted it into the alloy in a way that was thousands of times more delicate than a scalpel. With a strange tremor, the alloy suddenly collapsed, turning into countless fragments that floated away from its original position. Puff, because of the traction of the vacuum, the surrounding air was poured into it crazily, making a long air explosion. Then, with a soft thud, a heavy object hit the floor. It really is exactly the same as me. Although he already knew, when he saw the sculpture, Luo Fan still felt a little emotional. Not only did this sculpture look exactly the same as him, but even its temperament and the feeling of the world that it faintly revealed were almost exactly the same as him. At this moment, a mysterious wave spread out from the statue. This kind of fluctuation couldn't be described in words. Even Luo Fan could only feel it with his law power at this time. The surrounding laws seemed to be undergoing some kind of indescribable reconstruction under this fluctuation. This kind of reconstruction was not like the ordinary kind of reconstruction of the laws. Instead, it was a kind of thorough reconstruction that went into the deepest part of the laws, from the inside to the outside, from top to bottom. Such a degree of reconstruction was simply like opening up a new world. "You want to seize control of this area?" Luo Fan frowned, and with a thought, his magical power trembled slightly. In an instant, like plucking the strings of a zither, it fluctuated all the laws that he could come into contact with. A strange and mysterious sound came from the laws, and the area began to distort strangely under this sound. A kind of chaos that came from the root gradually dominated the space of the 365th underground floor. At this moment, the sculpture suddenly shook, and a creaking sound came from it. Following this sound, the wave coming from the sculpture began to gradually converge. Without this wave to fight against Luofan's magical power naturally stopped, and the space of the 365th underground floor gradually returned to its original order and calmness. It came back to life? Luofan frowned and thought to himself. Obviously, his focus at this time was on the sculpture. At this moment, an inexplicable impulse surged in his heart. He wanted to punch the sculpture. For Luofan, who did not understand this sculpture, there was no difference in doing anything now. In other words, giving it a punch and waiting here would have the same effect on the final result. In that case, since he had such an impulse now, he naturally would not hold back. He immediately mobilized the power of the laws and condensed it on his fist, and with the help of the power of the laws, he began to move the laws in the surroundings. He condensed a power that was countless times stronger than when he dealt with the rune earlier, and then he smashed it towards the head of the statue. The power of this punch was much stronger than it had been in the past. Even time and space were shattered by this punch, and even the laws were broken everywhere, causing everything around the fist to seem extremely chaotic. Countless lights and shadows appeared, and countless facts that should have been absurd appeared naturally. Countless facts that should have been normal became absurd illusions. Chapter 1929. However, it was clear that Luofan's goal wasn't to destroy the world, but to see the reaction of the statue. His fist seemed to transcend time as it slammed into the statue in front of him. At this moment, time became chaotic and space exploded. The nomological laws seemed to have suddenly turned into ordinary nomological laws of heaven and earth as they began to tremble violently and crack continuously, creating unimaginable chaos. This chaos made the space on the 365th floor seem to have expanded countless times, turning into an incomparably chaotic world. However, this chaotic world seemed to be unable to contain an existence of Luofan's size. It produced an unimaginable repulsive force that rejected his body, his power, and everything else about him. At this moment, Luofan's eyes narrowed, and the power of laws quickly condensed, giving his eyes the power to see through everything in an instant. He directly swept away the boundless chaos in front of him, and found the source behind this chaos, or rather, the source of this chaos. The statue appeared clearly in his eyes. However, this time, the statue no longer looked the same as before. Instead, it was covered in countless cracks. These cracks were densely distributed all over the statue, completely wrapping it up. However, the dense cracks didn't seem to be coming from the inside of the statue. Instead, the cracks seemed to be on the verge of shattering. Instead, it seemed more like the cracks were caused by a layer of the statue's shackles cracking. Crack, 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 crack. A soft sound came from the sculpture. Every sound was like a giant hammer smashing into the surrounding heaven and earth, directly calming down the chaos in the surroundings. Just like that, after dozens of explosions, the chaos had completely calmed down. However, the 365th floor no longer looked the same after it calmed down. Instead, it had become a completely unfamiliar and distorted place. Here, nothing was normal. Everything. It was as if everything was pieced together after being completely shattered. Even time and space were the same. In this place, time was completely distorted. Time flowed normally at this location, but at the location that was only a few centimeters away, time flowed thousands of times faster than normal, and at the other location, time flowed thousands of times slower than normal. The same was true for space. It was supposed to be that space, but at this moment it had become this space. This space was supposed to be gentle and calm, but now it had become distorted and turbulent, as if there was a hand plucking the invisible strings of a zither at all times. At this moment, the statue's appearance was completely revealed in front of Luo Fan. He turned into another Luo Fan. A Luo Fan with a body made of flesh and blood that was completely devoid of any stone color. However, it had already peeled off the layer of stone skin on the surface of the stone. As expected, the first person I see is still you, this Luo Fan said after seeing Luo Fan. The voice he used was naturally exactly the same as Luo Fan's. However, Luo Fan did not hear the feeling that belonged to him. Instead, it seemed to have a feeling that he had heard before, the will of heaven and earth. His eyes were wide open, and a look of disbelief appeared on his face. The feeling that came from the voice of the other Luo Fan in front of him. It was the feeling that belonged to the will of heaven and earth. Moreover, it was not any will of heaven and earth. On the contrary, it was the one that he had dealt with before. Back then, it was the will of heaven and earth that wanted to completely duplicate him and replace his existence to become a true sage. Of course it's me. Who else but me? The other Luo Fan said. As he spoke, he moved his body. Every time he moved, there was an inexplicable fluctuation coming from his body. It directly smoothed out the surrounding spacetime. In just a few moves, the originally indescribably chaotic spacetime had completely returned to its original state of calmness. However, there were still many differences from before. Now there was more nature in this place. In other words, it was like nature in a barren land. It did not look like a research site that Luo Fan had spent a lot of effort to create. All the research equipment had been decomposed into various substances in this barren land. This is my destiny. How could you come in? Luo Fan frowned. This is indeed your destiny. However, this is also my world. The manifestation of the will of heaven and earth, Luo Fan said with a smile. I didn't expect you to have such a worldview. To see the root of everything as the law. Then, he suddenly said something that shocked Luo Fan. You've obtained my worldview? Luo Fan's shock didn't last for long. He quickly recovered and asked with a calm expression. Won't you know if you try? The other Luo Fan only smiled. As he spoke, he suddenly raised his hand and pointed at Luo Fan. A wave of law power suddenly gushed out from his hand and instantly penetrated through time and space. It was like a mountain or a sea as it pressed down on Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the countless heavens and earth, the infinite worlds, and the infinite space-time, all condensed into one and fiercely crushed towards him. This is definitely the law power produced by the worldview. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. In this realization, he also raised his hand and a wave of law power rushed towards the other party's power. The two waves of law power were extraordinary powers that transcended space-time and everything. Time was meaningless to them. Therefore, although there was a difference in the timing, the two attacks still collided at the center of the two of them, resulting in an earth-shattering explosion that formed an incomparably terrifying impact. For a time, the entire 365th floor was directly shattered, and the terrifying impact rushed upwards, continuously shattering the space above until it was close to the 200th floor below before finally stopping. However, even if that was the case, the layers of space above would still be extremely powerful. There were even a few thousand researchers who were knocked into the air by the shock wave, and their heads were broken and bleeding. There were even a few dozen who were too unlucky and had their brains burst open. He died a violent death. Neither of the two law powers was able to suppress the other, and they actually turned into a force that shot upwards instead of rushing towards either of them. However, this did not mean that the two of them were uninjured. In fact, the surrounding chaos caused by that kind of impact. However, it passed through the layers of space and directly affected the two of them, causing both of them to bleed at the same time. The scene looked extremely tragic. Good. This power is indeed mysterious. The other Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of the world, laughed out loud at this moment. He did not move at all, but the numerous injuries on his body were completely healed in an instant. Even the blood that gushed out of his body instantly flowed back into his body. It was as if time had begun to flow backwards. This kind of control over law powers was no less than that of Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression became rather ugly. At this moment, the injuries on his body had also completely healed. He had also completely retrieved the blood. However, although he had achieved the same thing, he could see that from the beginning until now, the other Luo Fan had not used his full strength, and only used a portion of his power. In other words, the other party was just limiting himself to play with him. As for why he could see this, it was because he knew very well that the other party was the will of the world. Although this part of the world had been completely changed by the great calamity, the essence still existed. The various changes that were caused when it first appeared were proof of this. However, under such circumstances, the other party was only using the abilities that he had and the means that he had to fight with him. No matter how he looked at it, wasn't this just restricting him? At this moment, he said lightly, "What abilities do you have? Take them all out." No, no, no. This sentence should be said by me. Now I have already thought of a better way to replace you. You'd better use all the abilities that you have now. In this way, after I replace you, I will be able to be more like you, and I will be able to obtain more of your cultivation achievements, and have a higher chance of becoming a true sage. The other Luo Fan said. There was an incomparably sincere light in his eyes, and it did not feel like he was saying any cruel facts at all. Replace me? Luo Fan just sighed. Perhaps it is because you have this mentality that you have always failed. Why? The other Luo Fan furrowed his eyebrows. True sage is a supreme achievement that is absolutely self-determined. This kind of achievement and even the worldview is not the same as the outside world. It must exist independently of everything. How can such an achievement be achieved by replacing others? As long as you have the thought of replacing me, then you will not be able to become a true sage. Luo Fan said. Now you are just a strong person who is pursuing to become a true sage. I, on the other hand, have fallen from a true sage level will of the world. In terms of understanding of true sages, I am countless times more than you. You are still far from being able to preach to me. The other Luo Fan said with a smile. When Luo Fan heard this, he could only smile bitterly. Actually, he should have guessed such an answer, not because he had guessed the content, and not because he had guessed the method of rejection, but because he had guessed that the other party would not be so easily convinced by him. After all, this was the will of the world, and it was a strong person who had imitated him. How could such an existence be convinced with just a few words? Even if what he said was the truth, the other party would definitely treat it as some kind of fallacy and believe in his own reasoning and understanding. Under such circumstances, even if he spilled everything out, the other party would definitely deny it at the first possible moment. Seems like there is no other way. He could only sigh. Are you planning to give up? The other Luo Fan asked curiously. Of course not. Luo Fan only smiled at this time. As he smiled, he raised his hand and slapped at the other Luo Fan. A rune appeared in his hand and rushed towards the other party as if it had transcended time. In the blink of an eye, it had already broken through time and space and arrived in front of the other Luo Fan. It looked like it was going to crash into his head. At this moment, the other Luo Fan suddenly reacted. However, he did not stop it. Instead, he frowned and waited there quietly to welcome the arrival of the rune. For a moment, endless information was poured into his heart through the rune and began to drown him completely. This rune was not something else. It was the rune that Luo Fan had learned from this world, the one that could encompass the world view. And the world view that Luo Fan had poured into this rune just now was his own world view. The reason why he did this was because he did not believe it. He did not believe it. He had sorted it out bit by bit from nothing. A worldview that was completely suitable for him would be suitable for anyone else, especially a clone that had been copied from him by the will of the world. In his opinion, even if the performance of this other Luo fan was similar to him, even if the aura of his worldview was similar to his, it was still just a simulation. It was impossible for the other party's worldview to be the same as his own. In other words, the worldview was in conflict with his. Under such circumstances, the more information about the worldview that was poured into the other party's heart, the greater the pressure the other party's heart would bear. At a certain moment, when this pressure increased beyond a certain limit, the other party's heart would naturally collapse. Of course, this was the most beautiful wish. The possibility of it developing to that point was quite small. It was more likely that as the other party's understanding of the worldview deepened, they would eventually find that this worldview was incompatible with their own, and then abandon this worldview. For the other Luo fan that Luo fan was facing at this time, abandoning the worldview was naturally equivalent to abandoning the identity of Luo fan. Once he reached that step, it would naturally be equivalent to completely abandoning the worldview. The other Luo fan might know about Luo fan's plan. He might not know, but no matter what, his confidence in himself was not inferior to that of the real Luo fan. At this time, he did not hesitate to completely accept all the information about the worldview that Luo fan poured into him. As the information about the worldview poured in, the aura emitted by the other Luo fan became more and more equivalent to Luo fan. Even the magic power of laws began to gradually increase because of this. Originally, the magic power in his body was only a complete copy of Luo fan and a complete imitation of Luo fan. So, although its power was infinite, its roots were still in Luo fan. But now it was different. Now, he had truly begun to give birth to the magic power of laws. These newly born magic power of laws began to produce subtle differences from the original magic power of laws of Luo fan. This difference could only exist in the perception of those with sharp senses. As for how to express it and find it, they were completely at a loss. If it was someone with a slower perception, they might think that this difference was just an illusion. However, it was obvious that Luo fan was not that kind of person with a slow perception. On the contrary, as the true source of the magic power of laws, his comprehension of the magic power of laws was deeper than any other existence, including the will of the world. Therefore, he instantly understood the root cause of this difference. A faint smile appeared on his face as he said, "It seems that I guessed right." Hearing this, the other Luo fan laughed loudly, "Ha ha ha ha! So that's how it is, so that's how it is." This part of the world was actually so mysterious, it was practically a true saint. It seems that my decision this time was unprecedentedly wise. There's hope for me to achieve the Tao, there's hope for me to achieve the Tao. As he laughed, waves of magic power of laws began to be born in his body. Compared to the speed at which Luo fan cultivated his magic power in the past, the speed at which it was born was hundreds of millions of times, or even trillions of times faster. In just a few breaths, the magic power of laws in his body had already overflowed out of his body and started to flow like a vast chaotic state. It began to continuously erode the surrounding space-time, the surrounding laws of laws, and even the more fundamental nature of the world. It was as if he had already become the ruler of the chaotic state, and now he was going to turn this part of the world into a chaotic state again. At this moment, a strange vibration began to spread from the surroundings of the magic power of laws that had become gray because it was too dense, and the first thing to bear the brunt of it was the building. For a moment, all the living beings in the building felt as if the end of the world had arrived. It was as if this part of the world was about to be annihilated. Then, the other living beings around the building also felt the existence of this fluctuation. They also felt as if the world was about to be annihilated and the world was about to be destroyed in just a few dozen breaths. The entire Federation and the entire world also sensed the existence of this fluctuation and were also affected by the emotions caused by this fluctuation. Come at me. At this moment, the manifestation of the will of the world, Luo Fan, shouted and raised his hand to grab at the void. The infinite magic power of laws was like a giant beast that opened its mouth and pounced directly at Luo Fan. Chapter 1930. After Luo Fan was completely submerged in the boundless law power, the other Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world revealed a puzzled expression. Please search for new updates. How could it be so easy? He muttered. Although he was extremely confident in his heart and firmly believed that he could defeat Luo Fan, he did not think that it would be an easy task. At least, it wouldn't be so easy. In his opinion, even if he could win in the end, he would have to go through countless fierce battles and destroy most of the world before he could barely subdue Yi Shiwen. In the end, he had to pay a huge price and suffer heavy losses before he could barely achieve it. Clearly, everything that was happening before his eyes had toppled everything he knew. It made him realize that all of his previous predictions had turned into bubbles. Could it be that I have overestimated him? Such a thought suddenly flashed across his mind. But soon enough, he shook his head. Based on his understanding of Luo Fan, how could such a situation occur? If he hadn't clearly understood Luo Fan's strength, how much potential he had, and how terrifying he was, how could he have made Luo Fan his own goal? Looks like he's plotting something, he sighed, but there was an inexplicable joy in his eyes. This was naturally not because he was a masochist or something, but because the stronger Luo Fan was, the more ideas he had, and the more cards he would reveal. And the more trump cards he revealed, the more he would be able to see Luo Fan's characteristics, and the easier it would be for him to replace Luo Fan. This was a mentality that only the will of the world that had absolute confidence in itself could have. Then let's have some fun. The Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world smiled and slowly withdrew the endless law power around his body. The power of laws was only a kind of basic magic power. Although it was many times stronger than other powers in essence, and it was even much stronger than the powerful power that Luo Fan originally had in his body, just from the perspective of the extraordinary power derived from this worldview, it was not enough to make him feel weak. This kind of power was only the foundation, and the foundation was not just a sign of weakness. It also represented endless potential for improvement. Therefore, under the control of the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world, the law power began to gradually purify and compress. Its volume began to gradually decrease. In the end, it finally broke through the limit and was compressed to the extent that his body could contain. Then, it was slowly withdrawn into his body. Gradually, the gray and chaotic environment around his body began to fade and was replaced by his original appearance. After all, I haven't completely devoured and replaced it. The development of this law power is still far from enough. Feeling the pure law power in his body that was 100 times stronger than the basic law power, Luo Fan was still a little dissatisfied. The Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world was still a little dissatisfied. This kind of pure law power was just a condensation and compression on top of the foundation. The entire transformation process was definitely rough. Even if he didn't know the root of it, he clearly knew that this wasn't the full power of the law power. If it was the real Luo Fan, with so much law power, he would definitely be able to develop the power of this pure law power by 100 times or even 1,000 times. After letting out a sigh, more expectations appeared on his face. The greater Luo Fan's potential, the greater his gains in the future in the following period of time. The Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world completely replaced Luo Fan's life, research, control his own power, and climb up in his place. He became an existence with more and more power. In just a short 10 years, he had replaced Luo Fan and become the existence with the highest power in the entire Federation. In the past, although his power was already the strongest, there was still one more behind it. There were still many families and many hidden powers that could be on par with him in terms of power. But now, after 10 years of arrangements and development, the current him had already removed this one. In the entire Federation, no one, no family, and no power could be mentioned in the same breath as him in terms of power. In the past, he could only dump the president of the Federation and make him wait for a few years. But now, he could dump anyone in the entire Federation like this. Even if it was a powerful figure who could dump the president of the Federation in such a manner, it could be said that the current him could be considered the true master of the Federation. In other words, he could be considered the true master of this world. After becoming the person with the highest power, the first order of the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world was to let the entire world study the laws of the world. That's right, he had completely publicized Luo Fan's worldview, letting all the living beings in this world, all the researchers, and even all the non-researchers help him to start studying this worldview. The power of all living beings is the most powerful force in the entire universe. This is especially true for the power of wisdom. It may take hundreds of trillions of years to sort out a certain world by myself. However, if hundreds of trillions of living beings were to study it at the same time, as long as one person out of tens of millions of people produces a new kind of harvest, then when gathered together, it will definitely be able to compress this time by hundreds of trillions of times. Perhaps, in just a few years, I will be able to obtain a truly perfect world of laws that can directly lead to a true sage. At that time, not only will I be able to truly replace him, but I will also be able to directly transcend the next few tribulations and become a true sage. The heart of the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world was filled with ambition. As the person with the highest power, his orders were the rules of action for all living beings in the entire Federation and the entire world. Therefore, very soon all the wisdom of the entire world was invested in that world of laws to study this world of laws, sort out this world of laws, and perfect this world of laws. Just as the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world thought, the power of wisdom of all living beings was really powerful beyond imagination. When the wisdom of all living beings was invested in a certain world of laws, the results were really like mushrooms after the rain. There were all kinds of analyses of the world of laws, all kinds of methods to reorganize the world of laws, all kinds of research on the flaws of the world of laws, and all kinds of suggestions for perfecting the world of laws. They were constantly brought out and presented to the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world, making him feel that his world of laws had grown and improved almost every moment. This, in turn, had an effect on his magic power of laws. This caused his pure magic power to change bit by bit, becoming more and more exquisite, and also becoming more and more powerful. In fact, even the speed at which they were being born was becoming faster and faster at all times. All of this caused the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world to always have a smile on his face. As expected, although the will of living beings has infinite potential, it still has its limit. If he had thought of this earlier, perhaps I wouldn't have had anything to do with it. What a pity, what a pity! Occasionally, the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world would sigh with pity. He enjoyed the feeling of all living beings helping him cultivate at every moment. The pleasure of helping him improve made the Luo Fan that was formed by the will of the world gradually calm down. The entire world fell into an indescribable fanaticism because of this. The world of laws gradually became the focus of their lives, gradually changing what they saw and heard. As time passed, it even gradually changed their world of laws. After 100 years, the entire world had become completely different. The world of laws had completely changed. The world of laws had become the true orthodox world of this world. The other world of laws had gradually become unorthodox and non-mainstream because of the in-depth study of the world of laws. Finally, the mysteries of the magic power of laws of the world. Gradually, the world had gained a path of cultivation that had never existed before. The path of cultivation of the magic power of laws. In other words, the civilization in this world. In the process of studying the world of laws, more and more living beings were born with the magic power of laws. The living beings that were born with the magic power of laws became the first batch of cultivators of this world of laws. The entire world had undergone earth-shaking changes because of this change. All kinds of existences that could only be considered black technology in the past had emerged one after another in the past 100 years. Because of this change, the entire world had undergone earth-shattering changes. All sorts of things that could only be regarded as black technology in the past had appeared one after another in the past 100 years. It could be said that the current world of this world looked like the world of 100 years ago after tens of thousands of years of development. It could be said that this world now looked like the world from 100 years ago after tens of thousands of years of development. The sky, the earth, the underground, and the sea were all filled with the traces of living beings. Because all the cultivators had only grasped the Dharma power of laws, the cultivators in this world had already developed countless wondrous methods of using the Dharma power of laws, even though it had only appeared for less than 100 years. As a result, the uses of the Dharma power of laws were greatly expanded. Even though most of these methods were superficial and not worth the attention of Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe. However, the numerous inspirations and sparks of thought that were revealed from within had many revelations for existences at their level. Therefore, Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, was constantly absorbing nutrients from it, allowing his understanding of the Dharma power of laws to deepen. In turn, it even gave him more ideas on how to refine the Dharma power of laws, causing the Dharma power of laws in his body to become purer and more mysterious. This made Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, feel that he had made a wise decision. He often stood at the top of the tallest building in the world and looked down at the fantastical scenes that he had created single-handedly. The feeling of personally participating is indeed very different from the feeling of macroscopically controlling and transforming the world's will. Occasionally, he would lament in his heart. However, it was obvious that he did not notice that this world seemed to have improved many times compared to 100 years ago. The process of development that had taken tens of thousands of years was compressed into a short 100 years. However, in reality, compared to 100 years ago, this world's understanding of the nature of the world had not increased. Instead, it had decreased. Moreover, as more and more creatures of the older generation died, the speed of this decrease was constantly accelerating. Back then, when the world view of laws was first announced, almost every day, trillions of viewpoints and ideas were presented for Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, to choose, analyze, and integrate. But, after 100 years, the number of creatures in this world had increased, and the research on the world view of laws had deepened. However, the number of ideas presented every day had decreased by more than 10,000 times. Although there were still a lot of them, the rate of decrease was enough to shock people. After all, even the weaknesses and omissions of the world view of laws had been easily discovered after 100 years of research had been raised. The easily discovered improvements had all been pointed out, and it was more difficult to propose new ideas than before. The decrease in the number was at most 100 times less than before, and that was already very exaggerated, but now it had decreased by 10,000 times. Moreover, the extent and speed of the decrease were still accelerating. This could no longer be explained by the improvement of the world view of laws. However, Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, didn't care about all this at all. Or rather, he had been completely overshadowed by the good development trend, and his heart was constantly immersed in that kind of complacency. He was immersed in the pleasure of improvement. He had already selectively ignored everything else. After 100 years, all the creatures in this world had been constantly researching, supplementing, and transforming the world view of laws. Compared to 100 years ago, there had also been a lot of changes. Not only had it become more perfect, with fewer omissions and more perfect, but it had also faintly added mysteries that the previous world view of laws couldn't have. At first glance, this kind of mysteries seemed incompatible with the world view of laws, but after a deeper analysis, one could find that it contained the true essence of the world view of laws, and contained a deepening of the world view of laws. It was also because of the existence of these mysteries that the universality of the world view of laws had become stronger. In the previous world view of laws, only those who completely agreed with this world view of laws, even if they didn't reach the level of the real Luo Fan, could cultivate the magic power of laws without the slightest bit of hesitation in their hearts. That's right, after all these years of development and improvement, the birth of the magic power of laws could now be transformed into a kind of cultivation process. But now, with the addition of this new universality, this requirement had gradually decreased. From the perspective of cultivation, this was a lowering of the threshold of cultivation, allowing more creatures to step onto the path of cultivation and become true cultivators. This was obviously a great thing. This was also what Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, was most proud of. This was because the more cultivators who cultivated the magic power of laws appeared, it was equivalent to him obtaining the wisdom of more creatures, and it was equivalent to him being able to use the wisdom of more creatures to perfect the magic power of laws and improve the magic power of laws. However, this was obviously only a one-sided view. The appearance of this universality meant that the world view of laws had changed. In other words, the appearance of this universality meant that the world view of laws had been changed by the many creatures, and it was gradually getting out of the control of Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe. After all, the worldview of a certain creature was an absolutely independent and self-existent existence. It was this independence that allowed the worldview to eventually be improved to the point where it could completely protect the creature from all external influences, including the possibility of being free from the influence of the chaotic state. Did such a worldview need to cater to the understanding of others? Did it need to be accepted by more people and be mastered by more people? Did it still need to be universality? From this point of view, it could be seen that once a worldview became universal, it was also the time when the worldview was abolished. If a worldview couldn't even isolate the influence of living creatures, did it still need to be able to isolate the influence of the chaotic state? From this, one would be able to find out. When Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the universe, truly announced the world view of laws and wanted to use the wisdom of all creatures to transform and perfect this world view, it meant that he had already stepped onto a wrong path. It meant that he had already stepped into a dead end on the path of the world view of laws. After all, perfecting, researching, and transforming were also a kind of influence. The real Luo Fan could see all of this clearly. At this time, Luo Fan was not somewhere else, but hidden in the depths of the world view of laws. Or rather, hidden in the depths of the origin of this world. This world was an extremely mysterious and incredible world. In this world, the position of the world view surpassed everything else. There was also a place for the world view in the origin of this world. In fact, any world view that had appeared in this world would naturally be able to obtain a place in the origin of this world as long as it was perfected to a certain extent. His world view of laws was naturally the same. Chapter 1931. As Luo Fan, who had transformed his life origin into the worldview of laws, it wasn't impossible for him to transform himself into a certain worldview and hide in a place that only the worldview could enter. Of course, he was a living being after all, and it wasn't a worldview. Therefore, he had to abandon a huge amount of things in the process to be able to hide in it perfectly. Among them, his body obviously couldn't be preserved, and he had to abandon it. This was also the fundamental reason why he looked like he was completely devoured by the world's will. Over the years, Luo Fan hid in the world's origin, trying his best to maintain his sense of self amidst the fusion and assimilation of countless world views. At the same time, he did his best to observe and experience the world's will's every move. Although Luo Fan didn't really know what mistake the world's will had made in the beginning, he vaguely knew that there was something wrong with this choice, and there were probably some weaknesses in it. Therefore, he was full of confidence that he would be able to achieve the final victory. As time passed, and as the world continued to evolve, he gradually saw the truth with his understanding of the worldview, and gradually understood what mistake the world's will had made, especially now, even though he was hiding in the worldview of the laws. He could feel that the corrosion of the origin source of the heavens and earth on this worldview of the laws and on him was at least 10 times smaller than before. This situation meant that the development of the worldview wasn't just weaker than it was 100 years ago. On the contrary, it was several times worse than it was 100 years ago to him. This situation was obviously extremely good news, therefore. At this time, Luo Fan, who was almost the same as Luo Fan, also seemed inexplicably joyful regarding Luo Fan's various things. Luo Fan, who was formed by the world's will, obviously didn't have the mood to care. For him, every moment was important. If he could deepen his understanding of the power of laws and feel the growth of the worldview of laws at every moment, that would be the most important gain. As for Luo Fan, who was hiding in the dark, to him, it had already become an extremely ancient existence. In his heart, it wasn't even as important as any idea about the world of laws proposed by an ordinary living being. After all, to him, no matter what, Luo Fan, who had already failed once, would never be his match again. However, in comparison, any idea that any living being proposed regarding the worldview might be an extremely important gain for him. Was there a need to say which was lighter and which was heavier? Time slowly passed in this state where both sides were happy. The cultivation civilization of this world seemed to be constantly developing. It was constantly flourishing. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. In these 10,000 years, the living beings in this world had changed more than a dozen batches, or rather, more than a dozen generations. Nowadays, the situation where countless worldviews flourished and every living being could come up with a different worldview had already become an era of ancient myths and legends. Now, all living beings that had grown up had only acknowledged the worldview of the laws. To all living beings, this world, this universe, the boundless primal chaos was constructed from the laws. Apart from that, there was no other possibility for them. This also had an extremely powerful theoretical basis. That was, following the worldview of the laws would allow one to cultivate the power of laws. Existences that followed other worldviews would never be able to cultivate the slightest bit of power. This was clearly a reversal of karma. It was precisely because of this belief that it was easier for them to obtain the power of laws from the worldview of the laws and step onto the path of cultivation in this world. This also made them more resistant to and distrustful of other worldviews other than the worldview of the laws. Because of this, it naturally made it more difficult for them to obtain extraordinary power from other worldviews. This formed a vicious cycle. As time went on, it naturally led to the current situation. The belief that all living beings had towards the worldview of the laws naturally made them believe that the worldview of the laws was more and more comprehensive. As a result, the universality of the laws began to increase. Now, the worldview of the laws was completely different from before. It could be said that apart from the foundation, the entire world view of the laws didn't seem to have much in common with the past. If it was the will of the world that had just stepped into this world, it would naturally be able to find something wrong with it at first glance. But now, after 10,000 years of assimilation, Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of the world, had unknowingly been assimilated by the world view of the laws. Everything had changed. For him, the change in the world view of the laws was like its essence was finally gradually revealed. The difference from the original worldview was the omission and mistake of the original worldview. With such a mentality, the more differences there were, the more satisfied and proud he was. Moreover, during this process, the power of laws that he had grasped had unknowingly grown to a level that was worlds apart from what it was before. Now, any trace of his power of laws could easily resist the powerful power of all the power of laws gathered in the past. He could even gain the upper hand and completely crush the power of laws. To him, such an improvement naturally proved that his view was correct. If it wasn't correct, how could he have obtained such powerful power? As for the feedback from all living beings about the world view of the laws that was being transmitted back to him at every moment, he had nothing to say. Didn't that prove that the world view of the laws was gradually moving towards perfection and approaching the true saint-level worldview? This obviously only made him more excited and satisfied. It was impossible for him to feel wary. It seems that my victory is already decided. The real Luo Fan was hiding in the depths of the origin source of the world. Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, the scene in the origin source of the world had undergone a tremendous change. Here, it was no longer as crowded as before. Back then, the endless worldview was forcefully stuffed into the origin source of the world, causing Luo Fan to have to bear the impact of these worldviews almost all the time. He had to feel the terrifying assimilation effect brought by thousands of worldviews, but now, this place seemed to have turned into an incomparably vast starry sky. Here, the worldviews that used to be densely packed had turned into sparse dots. In the origin source of the world, it was as if they were embellished in the boundless starry sky. Under such circumstances, not to mention the assimilation effect of the worldviews on him, it had become extremely difficult for him to even touch the slightest bit of the worldviews. It was almost impossible. Because of this change, Luo Fan was now able to use an even more detached and relaxed attitude to observe how he, the incarnation of the will of the world, was courting death. Of course, after resisting the erosion of countless worldviews for such a long time, he had also seen how his incarnation of the worldviews courted death as a negative example. Now, he had a much deeper understanding of the worldviews of the laws. Putting everything else aside, now, his law power had grown to an unbelievable level. Even the world view of the laws itself could not contain it. It could only dissipate and accumulate around him. If this had happened when his body still existed, it would have meant that his body could no longer contain the law power of laws, causing it to dissipate. Moreover, it was improving. It wasn't just the amount of law power. In terms of quality, it was the law power. Compared to before, it was already an incomparably huge improvement. Of course, this kind of improvement, compared to the improvement of Luo Fan's law power formed by the will of the world, there was naturally a world of difference. In fact, the two couldn't even be mentioned in the same breath. However, compared to the law power formed by the will of the world, Luo Fan's law power had a stronger vitality and more vitality. Under his control, the changes that could be derived were more lively and vivid. The special characteristics that belonged to Luo Fan were several tens of thousands of times stronger than before. It could be said that if Luo Fan's law power were to fight against the law power formed by the will of the world, Luo Fan's law power would not be able to put up any resistance and would be completely crushed if there was no technique involved. However, if it was turned into resources for divine abilities, turned into power to activate divine abilities, and turned into the foundation that could support all kinds of techniques, then Luo Fan's law power would definitely be able to leave the law power formed by the will of the world by a few streets. Of course, given the amount of law power controlled by the will of the world, leaving it by a few streets was obviously not enough. Therefore, even though he knew that he had the upper hand in terms of power, Luo Fan could only hide in the depths of the origin of the world and hide in the encirclement of countless world views. He didn't dare to leave and attack the will of the world, soon, very soon. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan's eyes gradually became empty, and his mind was once again immersed in the endless mysteries of the world view. If one could look at Luo Fan's worldview from a detached perspective, his worldview would seem to have turned into a dazzling diamond. In contrast, the worldview that the will of the world possessed, which had the potential to become a diamond, had now turned into a strange alloy. This alloy seemed to be extremely hard on the surface, and it seemed to have made great progress from the past to the present. But in fact, if it were to go against a diamond, the alloy would most likely shatter and completely collapse. Because of the prosperous development of the cultivation civilization, the scope of the world that intelligent beings were involved in was getting wider and wider. Because of this change, the development of the living environment in the territories that had been owned since the beginning was much slower than before. Now, although 10,000 years had passed, the development of the living environment in these territories was much slower than before. But it was almost the same as the first 1,000 years. This had also caused the environment to undergo earth-shaking changes, making the sky and the earth, everything in the sea, rivers, and everything, they were all filled with all kinds of fantasy and sci-fi scenes. But in essence they had still regressed in the beginning. Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of the world, was still walking around the world, feeling the environment that was gradually being transformed, and comprehending the sparks of wisdom that burst out from the interaction with the living beings. However, as time passed, he gradually lost interest in it. In fact, in the past few hundred years, he had never left the tallest building in the world. He didn't even use his own perception to observe the living beings. Instead, he wholeheartedly absorbed the understanding and explanation of the world view that was transmitted from the hearts of the living beings throughout the world. The floor where he lived was now completely filled with the mysterious magic power of laws, and under the transformation of the magic power, it turned into pieces of space-time and worlds. Worlds and worlds. As a result, the floor where he lived was created. It had become the most mysterious and dangerous place in the universe, and it had even become the paradise that all living beings believed in. As the will of the world, it had all kinds of mysterious effects on living beings. Moreover, although this world had been transformed by the power of the Great Calamity, turning into a completely different appearance and possessing all kinds of completely different profundities, it was still fundamentally the same world. The will of the world was in this world. In the end, it still had all kinds of privileges. Therefore, the will of the world had an incomparably strong attraction to all living beings in this world. This attraction, it caused all living beings in this world to have stronger and stronger faith in the will of the world. This kind of faith was suppressed by the will of the world's insistence on the world view of laws, and it didn't have any effect. As a result, after the will of the world recovered from its statue state, the living beings that saw it didn't worship it as if it was a statue. However, as the universality of the world view gradually spread, the characteristics of the will of the world had also unknowingly integrated into the world view of laws. As a result, even the living beings that adhered to the world view of laws gradually dug out this faith from the depths of their hearts and redirected their faith to Luo Fan, who was at the top of the tallest building in this world. The world view of laws itself had an extremely strong influence, and it was constantly assimilating him. Now, with the sudden addition of this powerful faith, the impact it had on him had become even more intense. Just as mentioned before, if the will of the world was completely awake, it would naturally be able to discover this influence, and it would give birth to a strong will to resist. However, it was very obvious that after being infected by that impression for such a long time and being affected by so many factors, the current him had already become unclear. Vigilance, emotions, and fear had all transformed into another form of existence. Naturally, he couldn't react to this. As a result, Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of the world, fell faster and deeper into this state soon. Luo Fan, who was watching this scene in the world's origin source, murmured in his heart. However, he kept suppressing his desire to make a move. Just like that, time gradually passed. Another 100,000 years had passed. On this day, the last region of this world was finally completely explored by the living beings of this world, and it was completely included in the scope of the worldview of laws. This made the worldview of laws finally reach a strange state of perfection on a certain level. At this moment, a strange laughter suddenly rang out from the tallest building in this world. This strange laughter sounded very normal, but the moment it appeared, it had already spread through the entire world. Every living being and every existence in this world could clearly hear this voice. For a moment, all kinds of indescribable joy appeared in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, they suddenly understood that the appearance of their faith, the existence that had guided this world from the age of chaos to the current prosperous cultivation civilization like a saint, was undergoing some kind of crucial transformation. The faith in their hearts made all living beings involuntarily kneel in the direction of the building, worshipping and praying non-stop. The faith that was tens of thousands of times stronger than usual was rapidly surging towards the skyscraper where the will of the heavens and earth was located through this kind of worship and prayer. It frantically poured into Luo Fan's body, which was formed by the will of the heavens and earth, causing his current transformation to suddenly take a big step forward. This kind of transformation was a transformation that Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of the world, had dreamed of. Chapter 1932. I'm finally going to take this step, he murmured, as if he was trying to establish a sense of joy in his heart through this. Unfortunately, he couldn't find a trace of joy or satisfaction in his heart at this moment. All he felt was that it was a matter of course, and he wanted to go with the flow. After trying for a long time, he finally realized that it was impossible, so he immediately gave up on this idea. Since he couldn't find it, it was probably because he had long believed in this and felt that this was a natural change. There was nothing to be proud of or happy about at all. With this thought in mind, he opened up his mind and body and used his soul and body to accept the endless faith, as well as the law power that was born from the law worldview. The law power was born from the outside world, and it was also born from heaven and earth. The reason it came into being was that the worldview of laws had already become the main worldview of this world. In the end, the world's origin energy that should have been born in this world would naturally be transformed into the Dharma power of laws that was thinner and of lower quality. At this stage, it could be said that any living being would naturally recognize the law worldview. Their cultivation would no longer need to study the law worldview like before. Instead, they could be like other living beings in other worlds. They could absorb the heaven and earth spiritual energy from the outside world and absorb the energy from the outside world to strengthen their law power and finally embark on the path of cultivation. For Luo Fan, who was formed from the will of the world, this also meant that his efforts had achieved the greatest effect. As the main body of the law power and the main body of the nomological worldview, he naturally possessed the authority to control the countless law power. At this stage, it was equivalent to controlling all the origin energy in this world. Through this control, he would gradually obtain the supreme authority in this world, and in the end, he might even be able to replace this world. He would raise the level of his will to an infinite height. 1. The height of the will of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the origin source of the world, saw this scene and knew that the opportunity he had been waiting for over 100,000 years had finally arrived. However, when the change that he had been dreaming of appeared in front of him, He didn't feel as happy as he had imagined. Instead, he felt a little melancholic. There was a feeling of the fox mourning the death of the rabbit. In the end, I still came to this step. It's too difficult to become a true divine. He sighed to himself. What Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, wanted to pursue was to become a true saint, and then truly break away from any part of the world, and break away from the shackles of any chaotic state. All along, he had been working hard in this direction. He had been trying his best to reach this step. For the past 100,000 years, he had worked hard. It was all based on this. But, finally, at this moment, unknowingly, he had reached the point where he would once again become the will of the world. That's right. Currently, Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, was not forming the foundation of a true divine like he had imagined, nor was he becoming a true divine like he had imagined. Instead, it was slowly returning to its original form. That was the transformation of the will of the world that he had struggled to break free from. This kind of transformation. Indeed, it was a rise in level. For itself, that was the case. It was indeed a kind of sublimation, a huge improvement. However, this kind of sublimation, this kind of improvement, was what Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, wanted to avoid. If he encountered this in the beginning when he was still awake, the will of heaven and earth would definitely rather completely collapse and turn into countless fragments again. Then, he would condense bit by bit and grow bit by bit, and he would never be willing to continue in this way. However, it was obvious that this situation did not occur. The current him had long been bound by the world view of the laws that he had publicized. He had long become a part of the world view of the laws, but it was no longer the world view of the laws, but a part of him. In other words, the world view of the laws had now become his master. It had become the world view that could still exist even without him. In contrast, he had become the opposite. He had become an existence that would no longer exist if he did not have the world view of the laws. Under such circumstances, his thoughts, his wishes, and even all his senses and ideas would naturally be born for the world view of the laws. As long as it was beneficial to the world view of the laws, he would definitely do it even if he had to abandon himself. This situation was similar to the life forms that were refined by the innate inextinguishable spiritual light in the past, or rather, it was the same nature, just that there were two different manifestations. The current change was because the world view of the laws needed a will of heaven and earth to help it carry out in this world. It needed the will of heaven and earth to maintain this world under the rule of the world view of the laws. In the end, he was the will of heaven and earth that was chosen, and it was precisely because the world view of the laws had such an instinctive need that all the evolutions, and sublimations of Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, were unknowingly moving in this direction. I can't make this kind of mistake. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, he knew that he was no longer in any danger. With a thought, he slowly stepped out of the source of heaven and earth. After more than 100,000 years of development, Luo Fan's world view of laws had become purer and more condensed than before. It was completely different from the world view nurtured by the will of the world. As soon as the world of laws that Luo Fan resided in appeared in this world, he naturally felt all kinds of powerful pressure that were born from the world. They wanted to crush his world of laws, devour it, and assimilate it. However, given Luo Fan's identity as the true owner of the worldview of laws, his control over the worldview of laws was not something that others could compare to. Although this kind of pressure that was born from the heavens and earth was terrifying, it was still not enough. In the end, he was still able to rely on the uniqueness and absoluteness of the world of laws to block it. In the end, he was able to make it shine even brighter. It was as if a huge sun had suddenly appeared in this place. To Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the world, the appearance of the real Luo Fan naturally couldn't escape his senses. At this moment, even though Luo Fan didn't have a body and only appeared in the form of the world view, he had already cast his gaze over. Luo Fan didn't care about the gaze of the will of the world. At this moment, he just began to condense his world view and rebuild his body bit by bit. This was because he knew very well that, to the current will of the world, he definitely wouldn't be in its eyes. Even if it saw him, it would only look at him with disdain. It definitely wouldn't attack or devour him like before. Sure enough, when Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the world, saw the real Luo Fan, a deep sense of disdain appeared in its eyes. To him, Luo Fan's current worldview was too inferior. It was so inferior that it couldn't even be seen. An existence with such a worldview had long since become an ant in his eyes. However, he no longer had the qualifications to be his opponent. In fact, he didn't even have the qualifications to be swallowed and replaced. Since that was the case, he naturally could not attack Luo Fan at the critical moment of his transformation. As a result, he quickly withdrew his gaze and looked up at the sky again, gradually experiencing the process of his body and mind continuously rising and transforming. Construct the body. For Luo Fan it was not a difficult task. Not long after, he had already constructed his own body. As the body was constructed, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the numinous treasure embryo that had fused with the concept were formed. He naturally recovered and reappeared in his body. He looked no different from before his body collapsed. At the same time, the entire world started buzzing. There was a hint of indescribable joy in that voice. Above this joy, there was an indescribable attractive force that came from the depths of the world. It came from a place even deeper than the origin of the world, and it directly acted on the world's will on the tallest building. Due to this suction force, the building completely collapsed in an instant. It turned into wisps of smoke and gradually disappeared without a trace. Then, the living beings that existed within naturally condensed in other locations outside the building. Everything seemed to be the same as before they collapsed. Only Luo Fan, who was formed by the world's will, remained where he was. However, he had been standing on the highest floor of the building earlier, but now, he was floating in the air. He floated high in the sky and slowly spread his arms. It was as if he was embracing the entire world, but also as if he was waiting for something extremely sacred to descend. However, compared to the movements of his body, his eyes remained calm and indifferent, as if none of this was happening to him. It was extremely strange. This change was reflected in the eyes of all the living beings in the world. In an instant, indescribable worship appeared in the eyes of the countless living beings. Their faith in Luo Fan, who was formed by the world's will, became even firmer, and the prayers in their hearts became even more pious. Because of this change, the power of faith generated from the hearts of all living beings poured into Luo Fan's body, which was formed from the will of the world. It constantly pushed him to a higher height, causing him to gradually soar. His body also started to gradually expand and become bigger. In just a few short breaths, the world's will-formed Luo Fan no longer appeared in the hearts of the living beings through the indescribable connection. Instead, he directly swelled to a level that surpassed the imagination of all living beings. He became an existence that all living beings could see with their naked eyes. In the end, the suction force that came from the depths of the world's origin energy grew stronger and more terrifying. In the end, it surpassed a certain limit and shook slightly. With a slight tremble, the world's will-formed Luo Fan suddenly trembled, and his entire body collapsed. In the blink of an eye, he turned into smoke and scattered in all directions. Then, he was gradually devoured by the void and disappeared from the eyes of all living beings. More importantly, he disappeared from the hearts of all living beings. As he disappeared, the source of faith in all living beings suddenly disappeared, and all living beings abruptly woke up. What happened just now? Why am I kneeling here? This doubt surfaced in the hearts of almost all living beings, causing confusion to appear in their eyes. Their faces were filled with indescribable shock. I seem to have forgotten something extremely important. Just what is it? It seems to be about something. All sorts of headache-splitting doubts lingered in the hearts of all living beings, causing all living beings to feel an indescribable sense of irritation. At that moment, the entire world seemed to be on the verge of going berserk. There were hundreds of billions of living beings, and when so many living beings fell into irritation at the same time, what would the result be? It would definitely be war. At some point in time, a certain living being vented its irritation on other living beings, and it finally triggered a terrifying war that affected the entire world. This kind of war. All sorts of mysterious techniques and all sorts of strange abilities blossomed everywhere. All kinds of mysterious techniques and all kinds of terrifying destructive powers were released all over the world. Rumble, at that moment, an indescribable rumble rang out in the sky. In the ears of all living beings, this rumble was just a rumble. At most, it contained an indescribable majesty, causing them to naturally feel an indescribable fear when they heard it. However, in Luo Fan's ears, this rumble, it was the words of the world's will. Moreover, it was words that he could completely understand. Becoming a true divine. It's really not fated with me. This was the content of that sentence. It's not that you're not fated. It's just that you've taken the wrong path. Luo Fan sighed at this moment and said. His words directly shook the world view of laws, and through it, it produced some extremely subtle changes. After it was released, it became a sound that was completely undetectable to the ears of living beings. It spread far and wide, resonating with the new world view of laws in the origin of heaven and earth, and transmitted to the depths of the origin of heaven and earth. You've indeed taken the wrong path. The worlds will once again transmitted its voice with a boundless rumble. Obviously, it had heard and understood Luo Fan's words. This situation was extremely mysterious, but it was only effective in this world. In other words, it would only be useful in this world from now on. Outside this world, or perhaps not in this time period, Luo Fan couldn't understand the voice made by the world's will at all, let alone transmit his voice to the world's will. The reason for this was very simple. It was because his worldview was the worldview of laws. And the world's will had also grown to become the world's will in this world through the implementation of the worldview of laws, because it had achieved the world's will in this way. Even though its words contained endless mysteries that Luo Fan couldn't understand, it was ultimately still in line with the worldview of laws. And this was naturally what Luo Fan, who had created the worldview of laws by himself, wanted. He didn't need to understand it himself. His own worldview of laws would naturally be able to translate the words and become words that he could understand. Similarly, the words he said were the same. As long as it came into contact with the worldview and transmitted, it would naturally shake the worldview of the worldview. Then, it would naturally be transmitted to where the will of heaven and earth was located, becoming words that it could understand. This could be said to be a coincidence, but it could also be said to be an inevitability. However, whether it was a coincidence or an inevitability, it could only be effective in this world at this time. I really want to know what your current mentality is, Luo Fan suddenly said. He felt that at this moment, the world's will had become a completely different existence. It no longer had the hostility it had when it wanted to devour him and replace him, nor did it have the indifference and disdain it had when it was about to become the world's will. There was only a kind of calmness, as if it had seen through everything and seen through everything. My mentality? You won't understand even if I say it, said the world's will. Although it could communicate with Luo Fan through the resonance of the worldview of laws, the world's will was still the world's will. Its way of thinking was ultimately still completely different from that of living beings. Perhaps because of its previous experience as a living being, It could understand the way of thinking of living beings and understand everything in Luo Fan's words, but that was all. Its own way of thinking, its own state of mind, and its own way of thinking were still fundamentally different from that of a real living being. It was no longer something that a living being could understand. In fact, it was no longer something that could be expressed in a way that a living being could understand. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan had already obtained his own answer. Chapter 1933. You didn't come out to talk to me just to sigh with emotion, did you? Luo Fan suddenly smiled faintly. This voice was transmitted to the origin of heaven and earth, where the will of heaven and earth was located, causing a series of rumbling sounds to be heard. Amidst the rumbling sounds, all the living beings in this part of the world felt an increasingly strong pressure on them. For a moment, everyone lowered their bodies even more. This was obviously the voice of the will of heaven and earth. However, this time, even Luo Fan couldn't hear what it was saying or what it was trying to express. What's going on? Luo Fan frowned. However, he soon figured it out. Perhaps the emotions of the will of heaven and earth itself had fluctuated greatly, causing the words it said to exceed the limits that his worldview of laws could bear. That was why the voice sounded like a rumbling sound in his ears. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan knew that he could only wait for the will of heaven and earth to react. After all, the gap in level was ultimately insurmountable. Sure enough, after waiting for a while, the terrifying rumbling above the void began to gradually subside. In the end, it turned into some words in Luo Fan's ears. This world is being destroyed, I need your help. This world was born because of my great calamity, so it naturally can't exist for long. It's only natural that it's being destroyed. Luo Fan said. No, not this level of destruction. Not this level of destruction, but a more direct, more tragic destruction. The will of heaven and earth rejected Luo Fan's answer and said so. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, That's impossible. Although the direction of development of this world has been distorted, there's also a war brewing now, but overall, it's still developing in an orderly manner. There's definitely no danger of destruction. Boom, 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 boom. The same terrifying rumbling sound came from the sky again. However, this time, the rumbling sound wasn't as meaningless to Luo Fan as before. It didn't seem like a sound that could be completely translated through the worldview of laws. At this moment, the voice directly turned into endless information, surging into Luo Fan's mind. After his experience in this world, Luo Fan's ability to process information was many times stronger than before. If this boundless information was poured into his heart in the past, he would definitely feel bloated, and he might not be able to sort it out for a long time. However, at this moment, with just a thought, an indescribable rune appeared in his heart, directly absorbing the countless pieces of information. Then, it flowed into his heart at a speed that he could endure, and he easily and completely understood it. After fully understanding the voice, Luo Fan's expression became extremely ugly. The tribulation this time was not limited to a single world. Instead, there were two different worlds. Apart from the world he was currently in, there was another world in the outside world that was even more powerful and terrifying. Moreover, at this moment, the other side of the world was slowly crashing towards this side of the world. Seeing that they were about to make contact, is there no end to it? I encountered such a collision outside the tribulation, and now I'm also going to encounter such a collision in this tribulation? At this moment, Luo Fan only had such a thought in his mind. It was obvious that the result of the collision between the two worlds would be extremely tragic. Either this world would be completely destroyed or the other world would be completely destroyed. If it was a little more serious, both worlds would be destroyed at the same time, and there was no fourth possibility. Even if he didn't know the purpose of this tribulation, Luo Fan clearly knew that if the world he was in was completely destroyed, what kind of impact would that have on him? Although he had already mastered the power of laws, and the amount was quite a lot. However, compared to his true realm, he was still far from it. In other words, his current strength was much weaker than his true strength. How was it possible for him to escape from this world? How could he still exist after the destruction of this part of the world? Therefore, it was obvious that the only thing he could do now was to help this side of the world survive the collision, or even completely devour the other side of the world. This way, he might not be able to survive this tribulation, but it was the only possibility for him to survive. With all these thoughts flashing through his mind, Luo Fan could only sigh in the end and say, "All right, what's your plan?" "I don't have a plan," the world's will said directly. This answer made Luo Fan pause for a moment. However, thinking about it, the world's will was on a completely different level from his. It was obviously impossible for the world's will to generate inspiration under its will to survive. In fact, it was very likely that death was different from that of living beings. Under such circumstances, asking him to think of a solution was as ridiculous as asking a piece of wood to think of a way to save himself. Looks like I can only rely on myself. Luo Fan could only sigh again. "Although I don't have a plan, I can help you," the world's will said. As it spoke, a mysterious power of laws descended from the sky and quickly gathered in front of Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a bronze mirror. The bronze mirror was only the size of a palm, but it emitted the aura of the world, as if it contained countless worlds, and space-time. As the bronze mirror appeared, there was no longer any rumbling in the sky. Meanwhile, Luo Fan could no longer sense the existence of the world's will. He knew that this was definitely the last thing the world's will could do for him. With a sigh, he raised his hand and grabbed the bronze mirror. The moment he grabbed the bronze mirror, he felt like he was connected to it by blood. It felt like it was one of his organs or like it was his other arm or leg. With this feeling, he instantly understood all the effects and methods of using the copper mirror. The bronze mirror did not have any other effect other than allowing him to see the world's will's perspective. "I can't believe it's giving me this perspective." At this moment, even Luo Fan could not help but show a look of joy on his face. Being able to see the world's will's perspective was a great opportunity for him. The most direct way was, he could see the situation on the other side of the world through this perspective. This was also the main reason why the world's will had given him this perspective. However, this was the use of this perspective to deal with the impending doom of the world. In fact, it would be a great opportunity for him if he placed this perspective on the other side of the world. First of all, if he placed this perspective on his world of laws, he would be able to gain a deeper understanding of his world through this perspective and perfect it through this understanding. Secondly, if he placed this perspective on his own power of laws, then he would have an extremely deep understanding of the endless uses of the power of laws and all the mysteries contained within it. He would definitely be able to increase his strength by hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times in an extremely short period of time. Apart from these two, there were many other uses for it. Every single one of them was enough to allow him to improve tremendously. If this wasn't a great opportunity, he couldn't imagine what could be called a great opportunity. With a thought, he turned the bronze mirror. It shone on himself. In the blink of an eye, all the details of his body were projected into his heart through the bronze mirror. Next, he controlled the bronze mirror and let it go deeper and deeper. In the end, it went past the level of his physical body, the level of space-time, and directly went deep into the level of the origin of life. All the mysteries of the origin of life that had transformed into the world of laws appeared in his heart without reservation. This origin of life was reconstructed with his own will. He had already understood all of the profundities within. It seemed like there was nothing else that needed further study. However, when he used the perspective of the world's will to observe himself, he discovered The mysteries that he had originally completely understood in his heart were now shrouded in new shadows. These shadows were hidden in the depths of the world of laws. They were hidden in the bits and pieces that Luo Fan's world of laws had yet to touch upon. Moreover, through this feeling, he had a feeling that the mysteries contained in the depths of the world of laws were much more than what Luo Fan was currently displaying. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan almost completely forgot about the great calamity that was about to befall this world. His mind was almost uncontrollably immersed in it. He began to experience, study, and work hard to illuminate the shadows and enrich the world of laws. However, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan after all. Although he was immersed in it for a while, it did not take long for him to return to his senses. He used his strong will to break away from the state of deep study. If the world is destroyed, then no matter how much I study, it won't help at all. He kept repeating this sentence in his heart. He strengthened his will and forced himself to turn the copper mirror in another direction. He turned the copper mirror towards the sky, towards the outside world. As the copper mirror turned, the mysteries of his body and the world of laws were completely removed from his heart. There was no longer any trace of them left. They were replaced by the various things of the world. Observing the world from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth was like closing his eyes to observe the inside of his body. It was a kind of absolute control, complete control. It was as if everything that happened in the world was happening inside his body, and after countless overlaps and derivations, it would form the most profound influence on him. This was another kind of feeling of being connected by blood. In a trance, he felt as if he had become the world itself. Every breath he took would cause this world to change drastically, and it would become the fundamental change of this world. This feeling was equally addictive. However, compared to the world of laws that was directly observing and comprehending the world of laws from the perspective of the world's will, it was still a little lacking. Luo Fan was able to break free from his previous state, so there was no problem at this time. With a thought, he expanded his vision once more. This time, he looked beyond the world and saw another world that was crashing toward this world. The moment he saw the other world, he felt like he was looking at a mirror that transcended time and space. The world on the other side felt like it was the feeling he had when he was in this world more than 100,000 years ago. What's going on? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He was confused. A question gradually arose in his heart. With a thought, the copper mirror gradually began to emit a strange, invisible light. This kind of light faintly showed a kind of gray color like chaos. Following the changes in the copper mirror, Luo Fan felt that his field of view began to rapidly strengthen. The situation of the world that was fiercely crashing towards him began to appear more and more clearly in his mind. Very soon, his vision pierced through the barrier and he saw the scene in that corner of the world. When he saw everything clearly, his expression changed even more. Because a building that he was very familiar with immediately appeared in front of him. That building was almost indomitable. Its appearance, image, and even aura were all the same as the building that Luo Fan had built back then. At this moment, two pairs of eyes suddenly rushed out from the building, brazenly colliding with his line of sight. A silent thunderclap suddenly sounded in Luo Fan's heart. The copper mirror in his hand suddenly trembled, and cracks even flashed across the surface of the copper mirror. This is me. Me. In an instant, Luo Fan's heart gave birth to an almost unbelievable feeling. The two lines of sight that collided with the perspective of the world's will had almost collapsed the copper mirror. It felt like it was coming from him. However, how could this happen? Luo Fan was both shocked and puzzled in his heart. However, when he thought about the situation inside that world and the indomitable building, he suddenly felt that it would only make sense if there was another him on the other side. Who's spying on us? A cold shout suddenly sounded in that world. Although the voice did not have the ability to penetrate the gap between the two worlds and enter this world, Luo Fan, who heard the voice through the perspective of the world's will, was still shocked. It was not only because the voice sounded almost exactly the same as the voice he spoke. It was also because the voice contained the feeling of the world's view of laws was even stronger than what he said. There was obviously only one possibility. That was, the other him in the other world had a more complete world's view of laws than him. Moreover, this world's view of laws was definitely not the kind of world's view that was publicized for everyone to help him perfect. It was the real world's view that he had sorted out and perfected bit by bit. For a moment, the expression on Luo Fan's face became extremely solemn. "Who exactly are you?" Luo Fan asked. The voice was directly transmitted to the other world through the copper mirror. Most cultivators who had yet to become immortals were able to synchronize their five senses. For someone at Luo Fan's level, there was no problem at all. For the world's will, it was an extremely basic characteristic. Therefore, although he was only using the perspective to observe the other world, as long as he was willing, sounds, smells, and even touch could be directly transmitted through the perspective. At this moment, a tremendous rumble suddenly rang out from the other side of the world. It resounded through the entire world, causing all living beings in the world to feel a powerful dignity that directly affected their hearts. They almost could not help but prostrate themselves in worship. So the other me has already reached this step. At this moment, a figure leaped out of the tallest building and appeared at the top of the building, looking up. The pair of eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of the world and directly see Luo Fan in the other world. However, Luo Fan knew that this was just an illusion. At this moment, the other party wasn't looking at him, but the line of sight that he was transmitting through the copper mirror. However, due to the reverse effect of the line of sight, he felt like he was being directly seen by the other party. "It seems like you know your own nature and you also know me," Luo Fan said at this moment. The voice also turned into a rumbling roar in the other world, but the other Luo Fan could also hear it clearly through the world view of the rules. "Of course. I was born from the tribulations, and everything about my existence is completely based on you." The other Luo Fan smiled at this moment. Judging from his expression, there was no resentment or dissatisfaction. There was only an inexplicable sense of gratitude. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed. If the other party was only resentful, it would be fine. Although it would be a little troublesome to deal with him, he still had an advantage, so it wouldn't be too difficult to win. But now, it was clear that he had completely recognized himself and his opponent, so the difficulty of dealing with him had increased by 10 times or even 100 times. "I've been thinking about what kind of development you'll take and what kind of path you'll take." The other Luo Fan sighed. His expression was one of nostalgia and naive curiosity. "I think you should have seen it by now. How do you feel?" Luo Fan sighed. "I feel a little surprised and a little disappointed." The other Luo Fan smiled. "Why are you surprised? Why are you disappointed?" Luo Fan was curious. "I'm surprised because you're strong enough now, and I'm disappointed because the path you take is different from mine." The other Luo Fan didn't hide anything and answered without any hesitation. Chapter 1934. "In that case, your objective is the same as the will of the world earlier, to defeat me and replace me?" Luo Fan sighed and said. "The best novel reading experience is here." This was actually very easy to guess. The other Luo Fan's situation was very similar to his. Even his mentality was the same. Under such circumstances, if he were to put himself in her shoes, he would naturally be able to guess her thoughts. If he was in his opponent's position, it was obvious that he would be thinking of defeating his opponent and completely replacing his opponent. After all, only in this way would he have a trace of a chance to escape this tribulation and still exist after the tribulation vanished. Otherwise, if he couldn't do this, he wouldn't even need his opponent to do anything. He could just wait for the tribulation to pass. Regardless of whether his opponent overcame the tribulation or failed, it would still be his doomsday. Isn't it obvious? The other Luo fan said. It's indeed very obvious. I spoke too much nonsense. Luo fan just sighed. Since it had come to this, there was nothing more to say. With a thought, the perspective transmitted to the other side of the world through the copper mirror gave rise to countless mysterious and complicated changes. Amidst the endless changes, a figure gradually condensed in that part of the world. This figure was none other than Luo fan. In other words, this figure was Luo fan's doppelganger, or rather, a projection. Because it was a projection condensed from the perspective of the world's will, its strength was vaguely stronger than Luo fan's real body. The moment it appeared in the world, it caused the world to tremble slightly, and the laws there became indescribably chaotic. As expected, the laws of this world. It's exactly the same as the world that hasn't changed in the past. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo fan's mind. After all, he was a living being. Although he could obtain more information from the perspective of the world's will, he was still a living being. He could observe more, but there were still too many things that he needed to go through complex transformations to understand. In comparison, the doppelganger that he had condensed at this time was much easier to deal with. Even though it seemed like only a slight change in his receiving form, this change in receiving form had already transformed the various information he received into a state that was completely suitable for him as a living being. Hence, what he sensed at this moment was much more direct than what he had sensed with the help of the world's will. It was even more mysterious. Right at this time, a streak of spiritual light soared into the sky from below. In a flash, it had already transcended time and came crushing down on him. Facing such an attack, Luo fan instinctively raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The power of countless space-time dimensions suddenly condensed and wrapped around the spiritual light. The power of the space-time dimension was extremely terrifying in this kind of low space-time dimension. Under the suppression of this power, the spirit light was completely suppressed. He didn't even have the ability to resist before he completely collapsed. The power of space-time dimensions? I have that too. The other Luo fan's words entered Luo fan's ears in an instant. Immediately after, the surrounding light and shadow changed. The space-time dimension instantly became extremely chaotic. The rules and laws also became extremely chaotic at this moment. It was difficult to distinguish what form it originally had. In the eyes of all living beings, the figure that had suddenly appeared in the sky was suddenly enveloped by a mass of gray clouds. Then, the cloud trembled and everything disappeared completely. Everything was gone. Regardless of whether it was the cloud or the figure wrapped in the cloud, they were all the same. Whether it was the cloud or the figure wrapped by the cloud, they couldn't see it. They couldn't see that in the higher space-time dimension, the strongest powerhouse in this world had already erupted in a shocking battle with another equally powerful powerhouse. This world was mysterious and mysterious, wonderful and wonderful. The space-time dimension structure here was completely different from the Earth's universe. Here, although there was a difference in the space-time dimension, that difference was not the same as the Earth's universe. In this world, although there was a difference in space-time dimensions, that difference did not exist in the form of the Earth's universe. In this world, the higher space-time dimension was above the lower space-time dimension. However, the higher space-time dimension only existed in a strange way of space-time dimension construction. There were no living beings in it, and it didn't even produce a flourishing strange world that was comparable to the higher space-time dimension of the Earth's universe. That place was completely a boundless sea of space-time dimensions. It was like the state of chaos. It seemed extremely chaotic, but also extremely mysterious. And in this sea, the lower space-time dimension was like a drop of seawater that was relatively special in this sea. The reason why it was special was because under the higher space-time dimension, only this current space-time dimension had complete order and the existence of real living beings. It was as if the essence of all the other space-time dimensions had been attracted to this current space-time dimension and turned into resources for the perfection of this space-time dimension. It was more like an invisible restriction existed in this world, causing the order of this world to only exist in this lower space-time dimension. No matter which Luo fan it was, none of them paid attention to the current situation. It was not only because their enemies were each other, but also because they actually didn't think that this situation was anything to be surprised about, because this world was constructed from the power of tribulations. Moreover, the foundation of this world was the fragment of the larger world. Either one of these two reasons was enough to determine that this world couldn't have other endless lower space-time dimensions or the higher space-time dimensions of order. Naturally, there was nothing more to say about the world constructed by tribulations. Even if it was a great tribulation, it couldn't really construct a truly perfect world to test Luo Fan. He was merely an ordinary living being who was pursuing sainthood. Even if he had gone quite far on this path, in the eyes of the world and in the state of chaos, what difference was there between him and an ordinary living being? How could the state of chaos specially descend on a perfect world to test him? Since it wasn't even a perfect world, how could a perfect world with endless space-time dimensions appear? As for the second reason, the foundation of this world was the fragment of the larger world. This was even simpler. The larger world itself was an existence without tribulations and immeasurable. Although he still couldn't fully understand such an existence, he vaguely understood it. Such a world probably didn't have any difference in space-time dimensions. This was just a guess. However, regardless of which Luo Fan was, they were extremely confident in their own guesses. Therefore, they naturally agreed that it was unlikely for the countless space-time dimensions to appear in this world. At this moment, the two of them were in the sea of space-time dimensions, and the surrounding space-time dimensions were under their control. They constantly twisted and changed, forming all kinds of mysterious forms that would even make ordinary living beings' bodies and minds completely explode. They launched countless terrifying attacks at each other. Such attacks were extremely powerful. If this world had endless space-time dimensions like the Earth's universe, then each attack would probably be enough to destroy billions of space-time dimensions. It would be enough to completely destroy billions of living beings in billions of space-time dimensions. Even in this world, even in this place, this kind of attack was already incomparably shocking. Every single attack caused the dimensional ocean to churn, causing countless waves to form in the area. In their bodies, the law power surged. Every bit of law power manipulated the space-time dimensional changes, enough to destroy any lower space-time dimension. The efficiency was enough to make all those who claimed to have talent in the use of power feel ashamed to death. The two of them were a little different. Luo Fan's law power was much less than the other Luo Fans, and there was also a faint difference in quality. However, compared to his opponent, he had another advantage. That was, he had already seen all the mistakes made by the will of heaven and earth. As for the hidden dangers and weaknesses that originally existed in the world of laws, he had an extremely clear understanding of them. Now, with the help of the projection condensed from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth, the law power's manipulation of space-time dimensions was more efficient and more stable. As long as the other Luo Fan had a slight oversight in the operation of space-time dimensions, he would definitely be able to seize it and easily disintegrate his attack. In contrast, although the other Luo Fan's worldview was influenced by the development of the world in that world, he grew faster and became purer due to the conflict between them. However, in the end, he didn't recognize the various omissions and hadn't seen the real negative examples with his own eyes. In the end, there were still many omissions revealed in the battle. Of course, strictly speaking, those couldn't really be considered as omissions. They could only be considered as imperfections. However, such an existence had already given Luo Fan a chance, allowing him to seize the weakness, erupt, and instantly defeat it, completely disintegrating all the attacks. It was precisely because of this that the battle between the two sides fell into a stalemate. Whether it was Luo Fan or the other Luo Fan, neither of them could truly suppress their opponents, and neither could they achieve a real victory. The impact of this stalemate was that the scale of the battle between the two sides continued to increase and expand. In the end, the fluctuations in the space-time dimensional ocean became more and more intense and terrifying. In the end, it gradually affected the normal space-time, which was the most special point of seawater in the space-time dimensional ocean. So this is your goal. Suddenly, the other Luo Fan said. As he said this, he suddenly retracted his hand, and in a flash, he was already far away from Luo Fan with a faint smile on his face. When Luo Fan saw this, he knew that his plan had been seen through by the other party. He couldn't help but sigh. What a pity! If only I had a little more time, I would have achieved my goal. It's a pity that I still discovered it a little too late. The other Luo Fan turned his head to look at the extremely special point in the middle of the battle between the two of them, and couldn't help but look a little helpless. That extremely special point was naturally the normal spacetime, which was the only low-level spacetime dimension that existed in order. But now, that low-level space-time dimension was already trembling violently. Countless fluctuations rolled over and attacked it with great force, causing it to gradually lose its original position and its original stability. With one look, the two Luo Fans' eyesight easily penetrated the barrier of the space-time dimension and saw the scene inside. At this moment, the space-time dimension had already fallen into chaos. There were countless thunderbolts in the sky, and cracks would appear in the sky from time to time. The stars in the sky seemed to have been casually rubbed by someone, and had already lost their original shape. They would gather into a ball at times, and then randomly scatter at other times. The scene was so chaotic that it was unimaginable, and it was impossible to connect it with the real sky. Needless to say, there was no need to talk about the ground. There were also countless cracks appearing, and it was also chaotic everywhere. However, compared to the various changes in the sky, which were only shocking, the chaos on the ground was already fatal. Every time there was chaos, even the smallest chaos, it could be said to be a disaster for all living beings. Countless living beings perished in the chaos, and wails of anguished wails could be heard. A series of roars rang out from the heaven and earth. Perhaps in the other world, the world will had made a fundamental mistake, causing its own existence to degenerate back into the world will. Needless to say, his actions had created an extremely wonderful outcome. That world had developed into a true world of cultivation. There were powerful cultivators there. They were everywhere. That creature's ability to resist world disasters was 100 times stronger than before. In comparison, this world was the complete opposite. However, to the other Luo Fan was not a match for him. The development of this world was extremely suitable for him, extremely suitable for his cultivation, allowing him to obtain great benefits in the process of development. However, for the development of civilization in this world, his choice did not help much at all. In this corner of the world, they were still in the same state of technological civilization as before. Among them, there were very few living beings with extraordinary powers, and it was not even enough to form a complete cultivation civilization. Under such circumstances, the resistance of that world against disasters did not even need to be a world disaster. Just a small disaster with a slightly wider scope was enough to cause a disaster for all living beings in that world. Therefore, the current scene in this part of the world was really tragic to the point of being indescribable. Not to mention anything else, just when the two Luo Fans were confronting each other, nearly 10% of the living beings in this world had already been annihilated. It should be noted that the number of living beings in this world was at least calculated in the trillions. Nearly 10% of such a large number of living beings had been destroyed. This number was enough to make anyone with a heart of stone feel despair. The other Luo fan looked at Luo Fan and said, "This is not enough to completely resolve the danger of the collision between the two worlds." He was also Luo Fan, and his mind was naturally extremely firm. Although the world that he had cultivated for so many years had suddenly become so tragic, and so many living beings had died, it was not enough to leave any trace in his heart. He acted as if nothing had happened. He was still calm and indifferent. Indeed, it is not enough to completely resolve the problem. However, as long as the same change happens again, it should be enough to resolve the problem, Luo Fan said at this moment. After all, both sides had stopped fighting, and the tremors that caused the fluctuations of the low space-time dimension had gradually subsided. Therefore, the doomsday change in the world had also gradually subsided. It could be predicted that if this continued, all the disasters would stop soon. Luo Fan did not directly attack the low space-time dimension. Apart from knowing that the other Luo Fan would stop him, it was also because such a direct attack would not have too much impact on the low space-time dimension. After all, the low space-time dimension was not an ordinary low space-time dimension, but a kind of space-time dimension that was born from absorbing the essence of almost all the other space-time dimensions in this world. Such a low space-time dimension was strong and stable, and it went without saying. Luo Fan could easily destroy the attacks of other low space-time dimensions, but when facing this low space-time dimension, the biggest possibility was not the destruction of the low space-time dimension, but that he could not withstand the counterforce of the attack, and directly collapsed and died. As for why the aftermath of the previous battle could cause chaos in the low space-time dimension, the reason was even simpler. Because at that time, what really caused the low space-time dimension to change was not the power of both sides, but the power of the other space-time dimensions. Because there were many other low space-time dimensions as a buffer, the counterforce of the low space-time dimension was not directly transmitted to the two Luo Fan, but was completely digested by the entire space-time dimension ocean indeed. But now I already know. The other Luo Fan only smiled faintly at this moment. His words were filled with irrefutable confidence, and he firmly believed that as long as he was able to do so, knowing this, Luo Fan would never be able to achieve his goal. He would never be able to cause the same level of chaos again. Chapter 1935. As he spoke, the law power on his body began to surge. In the blink of an eye, it had already rushed out of his body and stirred the endless space-time dimension around him, causing more and more obvious and intense ripples to appear in the space-time dimension. Although these ripples were not as intense and shocking as the ripples that were created during their battle, they were still extremely terrifying. They were also becoming more and more intense. Unknowingly, they had started to head towards that special space-time dimension. They wanted to see the space-time dimension being shaken, just like what they had done during their battle earlier. Although this method was much weaker compared to the previous battle, if a large number of them were stacked together, the impact would still reach that level. Seeing this, the other Luo Fan's expression couldn't help but change slightly. In this situation, it was obviously the most correct way to destroy that space-time dimension. If Luo Fan could think of it, he could naturally think of it too in an instant. He also made his move. The law power within his body began to rapidly release from his body, and it also began to shake this part of the world. It shook all the space-time dimensions in the space-time dimensional ocean, causing ripples to appear, and they continued to move towards the ripples that Luo Fan had created. There were peaks and troughs in the vibrations. Superimposing the peaks and troughs in a vibration that were completely opposite to each other could cancel out the vibration. This was also the principle used by ordinary mobile phones to reduce the noise, and this was also the principle used by the other Luo Fan at this moment. The vibrations caused by Luo Fan were offset by the vibrations exerted by the other Luo Fan. Instead, the surrounding ripples that were gradually triggering the vibrations of the special space-time dimension slightly calmed down, Seeing this, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. At this moment, the law power in his body began to surge. The vibrations around him that were born because of his law power suddenly changed at this moment. They were no longer as calm as before, but rapidly changed. They changed hundreds of millions of times in almost an instant. For the other Luo Fan, every change was like a dream to him. They were all a challenge, because while he analyzed Luo Fan's changes, he had to exert an opposite vibration to counteract them. Only then could he ensure that the world wouldn't be shaken and destroyed. Compared to Luo Fan, this was obviously more complicated and difficult. For a time, Luo Fan gradually gained the upper hand. Those were the ripples caused by the law power. Although it was constantly being offset, it was still increasing at a rather slow rate, and the area of effect was also growing larger and larger. Although it hadn't affected the special space-time dimension yet, it was obviously only a matter of time. The other Luo Fan had an inexplicable expression on his face, but he wasn't anxious. He was just unhurriedly resisting Luo Fan's attack using this method that seemed to have no effect. Naturally, Luo Fan was happy to see this happen. His power of law continued to surge from his body without the slightest of stopping. He constantly exerted all the vibrations he knew, constantly causing the surrounding space-time dimension to vibrate in Luo Fan's own senses. Time gradually passed, and before he knew it, tens of thousands of years had passed. Of course, this was just his senses. In fact, in the space-time dimensional ocean, time had no meaning at all. In fact, if they returned to the lower space-time dimension at this time, only a moment might have passed, or billions of years might have passed, you don't think. We can get through this tribulation this way, right? At this time, the other Luo Fan spoke. Luo Fan frowned. Could it be that he still has other means? However, if he were to put himself in his shoes, there might really be other ways at this moment. The figure of the other Luo Fan began to gradually change. This change was extremely subtle and mysterious. Under this change, the surroundings seemed to undergo some sort of inexplicable change. Luo Fan was a little confused at first, but he soon understood what was going on and couldn't help but be secretly shocked. This was clearly a sign of synchronizing his own time with the time of the outside world. If this was in the lower spacetime dimension, it naturally wouldn't have much effect. After all, the spacetime structure of a low spacetime dimension determined the stability of time and space. Even if it was another existence at Luo Fan's level, facing such a stable spacetime structure, it would be completely impossible for him to completely solve it. However, in this higher spacetime dimension, the situation was completely different. In the higher spacetime dimension, time, space, and even space-time were existences with the same nature as any other energy. It was possible to change such an existence as long as it could affect the space-time dimension. Therefore, in this higher space-time dimension, the impact caused by the other Luo Fan's means was self-evident. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his own time seemed to be drawn out bit by bit. The tens of thousands of years of time that he had experienced before had unknowingly begun to be gradually reflected in that lower space-time dimension, reflected in the world where his main body was located. As a result, the collision between the two worlds started to accelerate and stack on top of each other. In this acceleration, the speed at which the two worlds approached each other began to increase rapidly. This is using the passage of time to promote the collision between the two worlds. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression instantly became extremely ugly. He had to stop this situation. If he allowed this to continue, his action of stopping the other Luo Fan here would become a complete joke. With this thought in mind, the magic power of the laws in Luo Fan's body changed its original constant oscillation and transformed into a mysterious method to produce an effect. It also began to assimilate his own time with the outside world. However, through the manipulation of his own time, He had compressed the tens of thousands of years of time just now into an instant. Therefore, this kind of assimilation, it was completely different from the other Luo fan. It was trying its best to slow down the passage of time in the outside world. Under this kind of change, the time in that special lower space-time dimension began to gradually slow down. The other Luo fan was also Luo fan. At this time, facing Luo fan's action, he just smiled faintly and instantly changed his way of assimilating time. Sometimes it was distorted, sometimes it was soaring rapidly, and sometimes it was slowly accelerating. Sometimes it was speeding up, and sometimes it was stopping, and so on. It was just like the powerful vibrations that Luo fan had displayed before, again and again. This situation was simply like a replica of the previous one. It was just that the active and passive parties had already been flipped over. The time in that special lower spacetime dimension was sometimes fast and sometimes slow. It was even distorted and sometimes spiraled. This was nothing for the creatures in that lower spacetime dimension. For them, everything was completely normal, because they were also within the realm of distortion. However, in the eyes of Luo fan, who was observing everything from the perspective of the world's will, all of this was so obvious that it caused his mood to constantly change along with it. After all, the active party still had a big advantage over the passive party. Therefore, at this time, even if Luo fan tried his best to resist and eliminate the other Luo fan's assimilation of time, he couldn't change the fact that time was speeding up and the two worlds were quickly colliding. It seems that if this goes on, the result will not be changed. After all, the result cannot be changed. Luo fan secretly sighed at this time. With this sigh, he instantly withdrew the assimilation of time in the outside world. With this sigh, he instantly withdrew his assimilation of time to the outside world. Instead, he concentrated all of his energy on himself. He concentrated on the trait that he possessed, which equated 1,000,000,000,000,000 years with an instant. As he concentrated on this, the influence of the accelerated passage of time on him began to gradually disappear. It didn't take long before there was no longer any influence. Although the passage of time was already speeding up rapidly, he was already one with the light. He was also observing and sensing everything at the same speed, as if he was under the normal flow of time. At this time, the one whose expression changed was no longer Luo fan, but the other Luo fan. "You've actually developed this ability to this step," the other Luo fan said with a somewhat helpless and somewhat admiring expression. For the other Luo fan, the ability to equate hundreds of millions of years with an instant was also a special ability that he possessed. It was just that this special ability only remained in his own senses, and he couldn't manifest it externally. Moreover, he couldn't really affect the essence of time in his body and equate it with the outside world. In contrast, Luo fan, who could do this, had clearly far surpassed him in this aspect. "It seems that there's no way to determine the outcome of a battle with you at this level." Luo fan didn't respond to that sentence, and he just said this. He didn't feel too happy about being able to deal with the other party's influence on the passage of time. Although this was a trait that he had developed by relying on his pure worldview, there were too many abilities that he couldn't use at this time because of this choice. For example, what he was doing just now, which was to continuously shake the ocean of spacetime dimensions in order to shatter the lower spacetime dimensions, was no longer possible. After all, at this time, he was entrusting his own time to the other Luo fan's change of time. Under such circumstances, in this high space-time dimension, any of his attacks would be within the grasp of the other Luo fan. It would be extremely difficult for him to injure the other Luo fan, to the extent that it was almost impossible. Under such circumstances, how would Luo fan choose? Was there a need to say anything else? After losing this effective method, it was obviously impossible to directly deal with the other Luo fan in front of him. "Don't you think that the outcome of the battle has already been decided?" the other Luo fan said with a smile on his face. Indeed, strictly speaking, what the other Luo fan said was correct. After all, Luo fan was here now, and there was no way for him to deal with him. And he still had countless means to deal with Luo fan. Luo fan just smiled faintly and said, "This is just my clone. Have you forgotten?" As he spoke, Luo fan's body in the space-time dimensional ocean began to gradually dissipate, and after a while, it completely turned invisible and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the other Luo fan's expression stiffened, and he sighed. His heart trembled slightly, but he could only gradually disappear in the space-time dimensional ocean. As he disappeared in the space-time dimensional ocean, in that special lower space-time dimension, his figure began to gradually appear from nothing. At this moment, Luo fan felt that the mysterious mechanism that affected his time suddenly lost its effect, and all his senses had completely returned to normal in an instant. Faced with such a situation, he naturally understood what had happened in an instant. He only showed a faint smile on his face. As for the other Luo fan's choice, he seemed to feel that it was only natural. After all, in order to maintain this mechanism that continuously exerted influence on him, the other Luo fan could only stay in that higher spacetime dimension. In other words, within the spacetime dimensional ocean. And if he stayed there, then in this normal world, obviously, he would no longer exist. In other words, this part of the world would be out of his control during the collision between the heavens and the earth, and he would not be able to control how it would develop in the end. In this way, this part of the world would completely fail in the collision, and the possibility of it being completely destroyed was self-evident. That was the other Luo fan. How could he sit back and watch this happen? Therefore, his choice. It was only natural. For Luo fan, defeating the other Luo fan in this level of low spacetime dimension was not an easy task. It was extremely difficult. Moreover, if things did not go smoothly, the other Luo fan could directly hide in that higher spacetime dimension and enter the spacetime dimensional ocean. In that case, even if Luo fan had an absolute advantage in strength, it would be difficult for him to do anything to him. Moreover, he did not have that kind of absolute strength yet. He sighed in his heart, and with a thought, this clone formed from the perspective of the worlds will had already completely collapsed with a slight tremble, turning completely illusory. It once again transformed into the perspective of the world's will, and disappeared without a trace. Do you want to leave victory and defeat in this world? At the same time, the other Luo fan appeared at the place where he had disappeared. He looked up at the sky, and his eyes seemed to penetrate the sky, penetrate the chaos, and see another world, then come. In the end, he spat out such a sentence. These words were resolute and filled with boundless determination. At this moment, Luo fan's original body, which was holding the copper mirror in that world, had a look of sorrow on its face. In the face of his other self, it was impossible to take a shortcut with a thought. He began to change the direction of the perspective of the world's will, from the other world to this world itself. Currently, there were still tens of thousands of years before the collision between the two worlds. This period of time was neither long nor short, so it was naturally impossible for him to completely change the appearance of this world from the beginning to become something completely different. There was no need to even think about it. However, if he wanted to use another method to integrate this world, so that the power of this world could be better condensed, and so that this world could perform better in the collision between the worlds, it was still possible. This was especially so when Luo fan now possessed the perspective of the world's will. At the level of the world's will, even the perspective already possessed supreme power, and contained endless power. With such a perspective, Luo fan could mobilize all the power in this world, which originally required him to use many methods to mobilize, with a single thought, and unleash all kinds of power that originally required all kinds of schemes. In this way, he would be able to change this part of the world at a depth that was several times stronger than what he could do alone. He would be able to make the power of this part of the world gather in a way that far exceeded 100% and finally form a crushing force against another part of the world. As his perspective changed, the situation of this world was gradually reflected in his heart. Observing this world from the perspective of the worlds Will felt like he was controlling his own body, and all kinds of indescribable comprehensions surfaced in his heart. As he comprehended these various things, the various imperfections of the world's operation appeared in his heart bit by bit. If he were to observe these imperfections from other perspectives, even if he were to observe them from his own perspective, he would only be able to vaguely sense them, and would definitely not be so clear. This was just like how only one could truly understand oneself. You are the only one who can truly understand your true weakness. No matter how much others could see through one, they could only see a part of it, and it was impossible for them to see through all of one's weaknesses. For Luo Fan, who possessed such a perspective, improving this world was equivalent to improving his own body. In other words, it was equivalent to another form of body refining. Chapter 1936. In an instant, all kinds of mysterious body structures appeared in his mind. He wanted to read books. After cultivating for such a long time, Luo Fan had already developed an instinct for cultivation. As these thoughts appeared, he naturally manipulated this world to produce all kinds of subtle changes. For a time, the wind and clouds surged. Endless thunder and lightning crackled in the sky. All the living beings in this world vaguely felt that an indescribable change had appeared in the surrounding world. This change was naturally both joyous and worrisome for the cultivators who cultivated the power of laws. They were joyous because the process of this world changing was faintly revealing a profound mystery that was greatly beneficial to the growth of the power of laws. However, they were worried because this change was pushing this world to a state that they didn't want to see or even imagine. This was simply abolishing their cultivation, so how could they not be worried? After an unknown period of time, the entire world suddenly trembled violently. Amidst the tremors, specks of strange light appeared in this world. Like snowflakes, they gradually fell from the sky. At the same time, the laws of the entire world began to change faintly. Originally, this world had already regarded the world view of laws as the only world view in this world, and the living beings in this world had already regarded the world view of laws as the foundation of their own cultivation. However, at this moment, after this change went a step deeper, and the status of one's worldview became even more important. However, this change was not all good for all the cultivators who cultivated the power of laws in this world. But it wasn't all a good thing. This was because as this process deepened, the concept of the world view of laws also began to slowly change. The original world view of laws was named after laws. The foundation was also developed from Luo Fan's world view of laws. However, because of the influence and changes of the living beings over the past 100,000 years, the current world view of laws had undergone earth-shattering changes compared to the past. The powerful universality made the world view of laws the foundation of the world view of laws. He had already become an extremely secondary existence. The most obvious manifestation of this change was that if the laws in the world view were replaced with anything else in the universe, this world view would only need some slight adjustments to be established. Moreover, the degree of perfection might even be higher than before. Even the fundamental laws had become an existence of such status. There was naturally a world of difference between this worldview and Luo Fan's true worldview. How could the two be equated? But now, under Luo Fan's transformation, although the world's laws of this world didn't immediately change into his own, it had already begun to change in that direction. In just a few short moments, he had already achieved the status of a general, from his original state of being dispensable. It had been upgraded to an irreplaceable state. Of course, although it was already irreplaceable, it was still not the true core. It was still inexplicably different from Luo Fan's true worldview. To the will of the heavens and earth, such a change was like that. It was almost painful. Don't forget how the world's will had grown into its current state. For it, which had achieved this in such a way, the change in its worldview was equivalent to the change in the foundation of its existence. If it wasn't for the fact that it was the world's will, its own level of existence was countless times stronger than that of living creatures. Such a change alone was probably enough to make it collapse completely, and all traces of its existence would be completely erased. Boom, boom, boom. As the world's will was in pain, a loud roar came from the sky. This kind of roar was different from the sound produced by the transformation of the world. It contained a kind of deep and intense pain, causing all living creatures to turn their emotions into pain after hearing this sound, regardless of their own emotions. Apart from this, Luo Fan's perspective, which was directly bestowed by the will of the heavens and earth, also began to tremble. It suddenly became blurry, and suddenly became excessively clear. Suddenly, it became distorted, and suddenly, it became deformed. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan's perception ability was already extremely shocking, and that he didn't entrust all his senses to the world's perspective, perhaps he would have already lost the ability to carry out this transformation of the world. Naturally, that wouldn't happen at this time. Thanks to his thoughts, the changes in the laws of this world became even more intense. The existences that belonged to the world's worldview that were hidden behind these laws also began to change even faster than before. Finally, at a certain moment, the first cultivator in this world collapsed because he couldn't bear the change in the world's worldview. With a loud bang, the area he was in was completely flattened. As this change occurred, more and more cultivators couldn't bear the change in the world's worldview, and they couldn't control the laws in their bodies anymore. This caused the laws to explode continuously, creating a huge impact. Not only did it completely erase the existences that possessed the world's worldview, but it also completely erased everything within a large area around them. In just a few days, the number of living creatures in this world had decreased by nearly 1%. 1% didn't seem like a large proportion. However, if the overall base number was increased to the state of billions of living creatures in this world, then 1% of living creatures was enough to scare anyone to death. However, there were living creatures that couldn't bear this change in the world's worldview, so naturally, there were living creatures that rose amidst this change. Their strength and realms began to increase crazily, quickly making up for the losses of those cultivators that had died. In fact, they even went one step further and increased the overall strength of this world. This was very normal. After all, because of the universality of the world's worldview, although it was suitable for almost all living creatures, it couldn't really be completely compatible with all living creatures. In this way, those living creatures that were truly compatible with the world's worldview naturally couldn't display the amount that they should have been able to display from the universality of the world's worldview. In other words, there was no way for their own strength to be raised to the peak. Under such circumstances, the world's worldview changed from a universal worldview to a true worldview. Although some of the living beings who had already engraved this universal worldview into the depths of their life source would not be able to withstand this change and completely collapse, at the same time, it would also allow these living beings who were in line with the true worldview to grow tremendously. After all, the world's will was the world's will. Even though this kind of complete change, which could even be said to destroy its foundation, appeared on its body. Not long after, it was actually able to forcefully endure it by relying on its extremely high level of innate quality. Not long after, the loud rumbling sounds that came from the sky all the time disappeared without a trace, and the inexplicable changes that Luo Fan received from the world's will's perspective also began to gradually recover. Gradually, it returned to its normal state. At the same time, Luo Fan vaguely felt an indescribable help from a mysterious place and blessing him. Clearly, it was the help from the world's will. It seemed that the world's will had already obtained enough benefits from this change. With this help, Luo Fan's transformation of this world naturally became faster, and the various body-tempering inspirations that emerged in his heart also became more exquisite. Finally, at a certain moment after an unknown number of years, his heart suddenly trembled. A strange body appeared in his heart. This body wasn't in the shape of a human, but a strange spherical shape. This spherical shape, at first glance, it seemed to be a perfect sphere, but as long as one zoomed in and took a closer look, one would naturally be able to see that this sphere wasn't perfect at all. Every surface, every curve, and even every twist and turn contained an extremely profound and numerous mysteries. This was a body-tempering achievement. However, it wasn't the body-tempering achievement of living creatures, but the body-tempering achievement of the world. That's right, this was none other than the body-tempering achievement of Luo Fan using the perspective of the world to understand, comprehend, and deeply understand the world. Then, he combined it with the principles of cultivation and body-tempering to create a body that was most suitable for the world. This body contained boundless might and boundless principles. It could even amplify the power inside this world by 1,000,000 times. It could be said that this body-tempering achievement was already the pinnacle of body-tempering that he had obtained in the process of countless trillions of years of cultivation. The moment this strange form appeared in his heart, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable clarity in his heart. In a trance, his mind advanced into an indescribable realm. In this realm, he could only rely on materialization and his own thoughts to outline the worldview, but now it had turned into reality and was fully displayed in front of him. The moment he saw his worldview with his own eyes, Luo Fan felt an indescribable shame in his heart. This was because there was only one adjective that could be used to describe this worldview, and that was scattered. The worldview that appeared in front of him was like a completely uneven fog. It was quite dense here, and he could barely see his fingers if he stretched out his hand, but it was sparse there, as if there was no fog at all. It spread out and occupied every inch of space within his field of vision. No wonder I've already sorted out my worldview to this extent. That great tribulation was just a casual simulation, yet it was able to simulate an existence that was much stronger than me in this aspect. Looking at the fog in front of him, such an inexplicable thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. After this thought, he immediately took action. His heart stirred slightly, and the endless description of the worldview in front of him began to enlarge in his heart. Every bit of fog turned into a strange world that was completely composed of various descriptions. It's the foundation of time. It's the foundation of life. It's the foundation of extreme laws, endless truths, endless descriptions, and endless mysteries drowned him in an instant. If it was the normal Luo Fan, he would have been able to keep his mind clear at this time. But now, in this realm, not only was he extremely clear-headed, but he also felt that he could completely control everything in front of him. He also felt that he could completely control everything in front of him. He could reconstruct everything in front of him according to his will and reassemble it. As he felt this, his mind began to change. In the blink of an eye, he looked at it from a more macroscopic perspective. The uneven fog in front of him began to gradually roll, and many of the fog began to combine. Many of the originally dense fog began to gradually condense in one place, and the sparse fog also began to gradually converge, gradually gathering together, and began to revolve around the edge of the dense fog. The whole scene looked somewhat similar to the process of a nebula condensing into a star in an ordinary starry sky. In the center, where the dense fog was, from time to time, wisps of fog would be thrown out from it. They would converge into the surrounding fog. Moreover, from time to time, wisps of fog would be thrown out from the still scattered fog and converge into the surrounding void, becoming faintly discernible with every change. Luo Fan felt that his understanding of the world of laws had deepened a little. He could feel every change in the scene. His strength was improving a little. In this wonderful feeling, time no longer had any meaning to him. After an unknown period of time, when Luo Fan felt that the world of laws had changed and could no longer change, he suddenly recovered. Sure enough, it has become like this. When he saw the change in the world of laws, he couldn't help but sigh, but there was an unconcealable satisfaction on his face. At this moment, the world of laws that could only be directly seen in this realm had unknowingly transformed into something that he was extremely familiar with. One looked like a sphere, but in essence it was completely different from a sphere. It was something that he had specially sorted out and created for heaven and earth. It represented his peak achievements in body tempering, the appearance of the world after tempering his body. However, compared to the lonely sphere that he had created before, there were layers of halos around the world sphere. These halos were layered on top of each other, and the further out one went, the thinner the halos became. At the outermost edge, the halos were so weak that they were almost invisible. With a slight thought, he slowly withdrew from this realm. As he withdrew from this realm, he felt an indescribable feeling of being able to do as he pleased from the bottom of his heart. For a time, all the mysteries of the world of laws had completely turned into instinct in his heart, and even his sense of existence had become faintly discernible. This situation clearly meant that his control of the world of laws had deepened to another level. Although he didn't pay attention to time in that realm, his instincts could already tell that the time he spent in that realm was definitely not too short. It could even be calculated in the hundreds of millions of years. However, when he came out, he found that only a moment had passed in the outside world. Seeing this difference in time, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He didn't feel any pleasant surprise because of this. After all, to him, the feeling of a moment and the feeling of hundreds of millions of years were basically the same. In just a moment, when he looked at this world again, he found that he didn't even need to rely on the perspective of the world will, and he could already slightly modify this world with the world will's method. When he looked outside, he found the abnormality of the outside world. So that's the power of tribulations, and it's not the state of chaos at all. Such a thought instantly appeared in his mind. Outside this world, in the world that was about to collide with this world, what existed was not the state of chaos as he had originally thought. Instead, it was a power of tribulations that was on a lower level than the state of chaos. This power was extremely similar to the state of chaos, and it possessed all the power that the state of chaos had. The only difference was that there was a slight difference in strength. It was because of this similarity that Luo Fan had previously mistaken it for the state of chaos. It was also because of this difference in strength that he was able to distinguish it now. His gaze penetrated the state of chaos. This was obviously an impossible task for the current Luo Fan. However, although it was difficult for him to see through the power of tribulations that was slightly weaker, it was no longer impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart shook, and his eyes suddenly focused. His powerful vision pierced through the power of tribulations inch by inch, and he pushed in the direction of the other world in his memory. This kind of advancement was extremely difficult, and the speed was also extremely slow. He could only advance a few inches in a few days. According to this speed, if he wanted to truly advance to the other side of the world, he would have to spend at least several thousand years to do so. Chapter 1938. This high spacetime dimension was an ocean of spacetime dimensions. The innate inextinguishable spiritual light was as conspicuous as a spark in the boundless darkness. In an instant, the endless space-time dimensions swarmed over and quickly rushed towards the man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Although the man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light could only exist for an instant, time was meaningless in this high space-time dimension. At this moment, the man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light had completely frozen its own time attribute. Although it could only exist for an instant, its existence was basically no different from other things and other space-time dimensions to all living beings and things in the outside world. In this way, The inextinguishable spiritual light would be able to interact with the other space-time dimensions and easily suppress them. The man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light's power was limitless. No matter how strong the space-time dimension was, it was not indestructible. Under the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, there was no way it could resist. Although it rapidly surged towards the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, trying to mince, assimilate and annihilate it, in the end, it was like sending a lamb into a tiger's mouth. Under the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, all the space-time dimensions had no way of resisting and had already calmed down. Under this situation, the countless space-time dimensions around the innate inextinguishable spiritual light were flattened. The originally violent state became submissive, and the surroundings were directly flattened. Then, they began to spread out in all directions at an incredible speed. From afar, it looked like a dimensional ocean of spacetime. Suddenly, an island that was getting bigger and bigger appeared out of nowhere. At this moment, Luo Fan had already made his move. With a slight movement in his heart, the flow of time in his body began to accelerate rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he had already experienced several years. During this period of time, compared to the collision of the two worlds, it was nothing. However, compared to the man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light, it was absolutely fatal. After all, the collision of the two worlds was described in terms of time span of tens of thousands of years. Compared to tens of thousands of years, it was naturally nothing. Naturally, it was nothing, and he could almost directly ignore it. However, the situation was different for the man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light. For this man-made spirit light, it could only exist for an instant. It couldn't even last for a split second. A few years was enough for them to be annihilated billions of times over. At that moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. His own ability to assimilate time, which was stronger than the other Luo Fans, was instantly displayed. In that instant, the time around him froze. It began to change according to his will, and gradually, it began to accelerate this influence. It did not directly affect the entire higher space-time dimension. Instead, it relied on the uniqueness of the higher space-time dimension to begin to affect all the surrounding space-time dimensions that it could come into contact with. An invisible pu sound erupted from the surrounding lower space-time dimensions. A few years was an extremely long period of time for those ordinary and ever-changing low-dimensional space-time dimensions. This period of time was added to it. It directly caused those lower space-time dimensions to erupt with a shocking change. After this transformation, almost none of the lower space-time dimensions retained their original appearance. Even some of the lower space-time dimensions even directly collapsed due to this change. Completely perished, this influence also continued to spread in all directions, affecting more and more lower space-time dimensions. Not long after, it had already affected that special low space-time dimension. It even affected the man-made innate spiritual light that had just rushed out of that low space-time dimension. At the beginning, this influence did not have much effect on the innate spiritual light. It could even be said that it had no effect at all. The innate inextinguishable spiritual light possessed the ability to freeze time, and it had already eliminated the assimilation, causing the assimilation to no longer have any effect on it. However, as the assimilation continued, as the special low space-time dimension with living beings and heaven and earth was gradually assimilated, the solidifying effect of the man-made innate spiritual light also gradually lost its effect. The feeling of time flowing slowly began to appear in the man-made innate spiritual light. Although this feeling of time flowing was still many times less than that of ordinary living beings and ordinary things, to the point that even those with less acute senses would not be able to detect the existence of this feeling of time flowing, it was still starting to flow. This clearly meant that the man-made innate spiritual light was only a matter of time before it was completely destroyed. At this moment, the man-made innate spiritual light instinctively felt that something was wrong, and it began to shake violently and struggle frantically. This was also due to its lack of intelligence. If the other Luo fan still had intelligence, it would definitely not choose to struggle at this moment. Instead, it would choose to directly treat the culprit, Luo fan, as its target to kill. Even if it had to unleash its final attack, even if it had to abandon everything, it would still want to destroy Luo fan before it was destroyed. However, it was a pity that it was insufficient. Because it did not have enough battle intelligence, the man-made innate spiritual light completely ignored the target of its birth, Luo fan, in the face of the horror of its own destruction. On the other hand, it only focused on fighting against its own destruction, trying its best to maintain the solidification of its own time attribute. It was a pity that the effect of time assimilation was only effective on its body, because its essence came from that special low space-time dimension. Because it came from that special low space-time dimension, the change of time in that low space-time dimension was a fundamental change to it. If it wanted to fight against this change, it was equivalent to fighting against the entire world, the very foundation of its existence. Unless the man-made innate spiritual light transformed into the real innate spiritual light, it would not be able to succeed. No matter how hard it tried, it would not succeed. Therefore, at this moment, no matter how hard it tried, it could only slow down this change. They could only slow down this change, but they couldn't truly stop it. It could not change its own fate of destruction. Fortunately, at this moment, a faint smile finally appeared on Luo fan's face, but his heart was filled with an inexplicable sense of relief. What he was glad about was that the other Luo fan had abandoned its own intelligence. If it had retained even a trace of intelligence, things would not have gone so smoothly at this time. Facing the man-made innate indestructible spiritual light that was obviously much more powerful than his own, Luo fan dealt with it in a much easier manner than any of the previous Luo fans. The artificial connate inextinguishable spirit light resisted for an unknown amount of time. In the end, no matter how hard the artificial connate inextinguishable spirit light resisted, it couldn't resist the passage of time. In the end, it passed the moment it could exist. The man-made innate inextinguishable spiritual light had already collapsed, and in the blink of an eye, it had completely turned into bits and pieces that were being devoured by the surrounding low-dimensional space. When the last trace of the man-made innate spiritual light was completely devoured by the surrounding low space-time dimension, Luo fan finally let out a long sigh of relief. Without intelligence to control power, no matter how strong it is, it will not be of much use. A kind of enlightenment emerged in his heart. Immediately afterward, with a thought, he activated his law power and began to communicate with the low space-time dimension that had devoured the man-made innate spiritual light fragments, causing them to collide with each other. The collision of the two innate inextinguishable spirit lights had various possible outcomes, but, under Luo fan's guidance, nothing else could happen except for the destruction of each other. Loud rumbling sounds constantly erupted from the space-time dimension ocean. It constantly entered Luo fan's ears, after an unknown period of time, when he finally destroyed all the low space-time dimension that had devoured the man-made innate spiritual light fragments. He finally relaxed completely. Seeing that there were no more strange phenomena, he didn't stay any longer. With a sway of his body, he stepped into the special low space-time dimension. After arriving here, he looked up at the sky, only to see that the sky was gloomy as if a storm was coming. It seems, there is no will of heaven and earth in this world, he muttered inwardly and sighed. He began to take action. With a thought, wisps of law power rushed out of his body. This pushed the world, which had already become broken due to the destruction of the world of laws, further into the abyss of destruction. The power of law was an extremely high-end and powerful force. This kind of power was even many times stronger than the power that Luo Fan had condensed. This kind of power concentrated on restraining other characteristics and only transformed them into the destruction attribute, constantly destroying the surroundings. It goes without saying how terrifying this kind of power was. For a time, the entire world, starting from where he stood, began to shatter layer by layer. Time, space, matter, and energy, these four basic existences also began to become chaotic. In this way, the creatures that had escaped from the previous chaos were once again met with a calamity of annihilation. Moreover, this time, it was a real disaster that no longer had any chance of survival. Although there was no will of heaven and earth itself still had a tendency and a mechanism similar to the survival instinct. At this moment, countless forces condensed in the sky, and terrifying lightning constantly fell from the sky, bombarding the place where Luo Fan was. Under this bombardment, heaven and earth moved one step closer to destruction. However, the target of the bombardment, the one who caused the destruction of this world, Luo Fan, who was the culprit in the eyes of heaven and earth, wasn't affected in the process at all. At least, it didn't seem to be too obvious. He merely condensed a wave of law power above his head and transformed it into a magical cloud. That was enough to naturally block all the lightning bolts and completely nullify all the attacks that came from the sky. Not even his clothes were lifted up in the slightest. Heaven and earth naturally reacted, and countless flames suddenly surged out from the ground and began to madly rush towards him, wanting to burn him to death. However, this kind of flame was even worse than the lightning. The lightning could still slightly shake the auspicious cloud. It caused the auspicious cloud to tremble slightly a few times above his head. The endless flames couldn't even do that. When they were a few dozen feet away from his body, they became powerless. In the end, when they were a few feet away from his body, they had already completely disappeared, unable to move him at all. This kind of attack failed, and heaven and earth reacted again, changing to heavy water that could melt everything. It fell from the sky, gushed out from the ground, and condensed from the void. It wanted to drown and destroy him with all means. However, it was obvious that all of this was to no avail. During this process, Luo Fan's expression didn't change at all. He directly ignored this kind of impact and this kind of impact, and so on. That heaven and earth. Time and time again, he changed the way he attacked Luo Fan. Time and time again, he changed the way he attacked Luo Fan. It really exhausted the imagination of all living beings. All kinds of changes were subtle and mysterious. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in admiration when he saw it. Of course, it was just admiration. After this admiration, he still did what he had to do. He still did what he had to do to resist. And the final result, he was unscathed. This attack of heaven and earth. Instead, it weakened little by little. In the end, by the time Luo Fan had destroyed 80% of this part of the world, the countless attacks that were aimed at him finally couldn't appear anymore. Dian Dian's attack, which didn't have much effect, was completely unrestrained. As this attack dissipated, Luo Fan's destruction of this part of the world was no longer obstructed. Finally, in an even shorter time, he completely destroyed the remaining 20% of this part of the world. The moment this part of the world was completely destroyed, an indescribable suction suddenly acted on Luo Fan's body. Following this suction, he suddenly felt that the vision of the world's will, which was originally one with him and no longer separated, started to quickly pull away. As this pulled away, his clone that was formed from two different perspectives started to rapidly collapse. Is this a trap? At this moment, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As this thought flashed through his mind, the vision of the world that was fused with his clone was completely pulled away. As the vision was pulled away, his clone also completely collapsed at the same time, as if it had never appeared in the first place. His own vision suffered a huge impact from the power of the tribulation and collapsed in the blink of an eye. In the end, it couldn't withstand the power of the tribulation and the huge impact caused by the destruction of this part of the world. However, at this time, what Luo Fan cared about was obviously not this point of view. His attention had already shifted to where his main body was at this moment. Here, he was floating in the void, and in front of him was still the intact part of the world. This part of the world seemed to be extremely compatible with his worldview. At this moment, a huge vortex appeared in the sky. After this vortex appeared, rumbling sounds kept coming from it. To other living beings, these sounds were only sounds that could cause their emotions to change, be it fear, excitement, anger, or gratitude. However, for Luo Fan, these sounds were completely different. Through his perception of the world view of laws, he could clearly hear that this voice contained words that belonged to the will of the world. "I've finally succeeded." This was what the world's will said. Following this sentence, the huge vortex began to spin frantically. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly sensed that outside the world, within the power of the tribulation, there were countless objects that were rapidly moving towards this part of the world and this vortex. Devour? Luo Fan frowned. If it was just devouring, there was no need to immediately abandon him and do it. Could it be that there was a deeper secret behind this devouring? With this thought in mind, he didn't hesitate to urge his own vision and began to see the power of the tribulation spreading over. He didn't know if it was because he had already experienced it once, or because his vision had improved after his battle with the other Luo Fan. In short, when he thought about the power of the tribulation spreading through his vision, he felt much more relaxed. The speed at which he was moving forward had also increased a lot. It didn't take long for him to see the chaotic fragments of the world within the power of the tribulations heading towards him. Of course, apart from his own vision extending into the power of the tribulation, the fragment had already passed through a large amount of the power of the tribulation and was approaching this part of the world. Luo Fan's complexion suddenly changed the moment he saw the fragment of heaven and earth. Damn it! It's absorbing the power of the tribulation. This thought instantly emerged in his mind. With this thought, he rushed up without hesitation. In the blink of an eye, his figure crossed the barriers of time and space and appeared directly in front of the power of the tribulation. His power of laws erupted in an instant and directly poured into the power of the tribulation. It quickly condensed imitations of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light in front of the power of the tribulation and turned into pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that brazenly blasted towards the fragment.